They called it the Edge of the Wind. A stretch of land beneath the Colorado foothills where cold lingered all year long, where snow fell as if it belonged to no season, and silence sometimes roared louder than thunder. There, under a frost-covered tin roof, stood an old wooden cabin. No smoke from the chimney, no porch light, just a shadow, sometimes two, passing behind a fogged window pane. His name was Jonas Hale, 42, a former Air Force special operative, once a name featured in military bulletins, spoken alongside words like elite, exceptional, survivor of the Aleppo ambush. But that was 6 years ago. Now he was a man without a voice, without footsteps, without the need to be understood. Jonas had once led reconnaissance missions in the borderlands, regions where maps held no names, and survival was measured in heartbeats between gunfire. On one patrol outside the ruins of Aleppo, an improvised explosive device detonated without warning, tearing through not only the mission, but the arc of his life. Shrapnel sliced through his throat, destroyed his vocal cords, fractured his spine. He woke 3 weeks later, unable to stand. Worse, unable to speak. He lost the ability to command, to shout a warning, to whisper his mother's name when the pain became too much. When he returned home, they called him a decorated veteran, a hero. But Jonas quietly left the cities behind, bought a small plot near the forest. No family, no comrades, no doorbell. He no longer explained why he couldn't answer the simplest of questions, like, "Are you okay?" Each morning he wheeled himself onto the porch, coffee cooling between his palms, staring out into the white beyond. Snow never stopped. But Jonas had long grown used to another kind of snow, the kind that fell inside the mind, muffling every explosion, every scream, every drop of blood, until all that remained was quiet. Too quiet. And empty. Out here, he didn't need words, didn't need rituals, didn't need to lie with a phrase like, "I'm fine." He only needed to breathe and survive one more day. Sometimes a delivery driver lost their way and glimpsed him through the glass. Some waved, some looked away. But Jonas never blamed them. A man in a wheelchair, face darkened by sun and war, eyes too sharp, too silent. It wasn't easy to look at without unease, especially when he didn't respond, didn't explain. Because sometimes silence wasn't a choice. It was all that remained. And in the long quiet of that house on the edge of the mountain, there was one other presence that never left his side. A dark shape moving through white snow without sound, as if it too understood all that could no longer be spoken. Echo, a German shepherd, once a K-9 unit with the Air Force Special Operations, trained to detect explosives, trace the scent of blood from hundreds of meters away, and more importantly, to respond to nonverbal commands. He didn't bark, or rather, he only barked when it mattered. On the battlefield, among crumbling walls and brick dust thick as fog, Echo had been Jonas's second pair of eyes. When commands could no longer be voiced, and the team was forced to move under absolute silence, it was Echo who led the way, sniffing out danger, signaling threats, and even shielding Jonas from what he couldn't avoid in time. They say dogs can smell fear, but Echo could feel the things never spoken. The explosion didn't just take Jonas's voice, it nearly took Echo too. The blast damaged his inner ear and clouded the vision in his left eye. For weeks, he lost all spatial orientation. In most units, that would have been enough to pull a dog out of service, end their mission. But Jonas didn't allow that to happen. He filed for discharge with Echo. Together. They went through stacks of paperwork, medical evaluations, psychological assessments, and special approvals from the Department of Defense. The reason Jonas wrote on the form contained only 4 words. We were wounded together. And so they came home. No parade, no trumpets, no glittering medals, Just two injured souls trying to survive in a place where the war had gone quiet, but the memories still screamed. From that day on, Echo became an extension of Jonas. No more sharp orders, no more drills. But between them, a silent language endured. Soft, subtle signals through a tilt of a finger, a nod, or even a change in breath. No outsider would ever notice. To them, Echo was just a retired K9, lying quietly beside a wheelchair each morning, eyes scanning the woods, ears slightly tilted toward the wind, as if listening to something buried deep beneath the earth. But to Jonas, Echo was the only one left who understood him, without needing words. There were nights when Jonas thrashed in sleep. The sound of bombs, the bodies of teammates, breath cut short in the dark. And before he could tumble off the bed, Echo was there, his paw steady on Jonas's chest, gaze unwavering, breath slow and pressed against his ribs like an anchor to the present. In Jonas's world, where words no longer lived, Echo had become the last remaining voice, a voice with no sound, but one that echoed forever in those who had lost themselves. That night began like any other in the mountain's shadow. Snow had started in the afternoon without warning, piling high on the road and treetops. The wind howled against the cabin walls, long and weary, as if nature itself was exhaling its exhaustion. Slow, relentless, bone deep. Jonas had just stacked the last of the firewood near the hearth when the power flickered. The room dimmed, save for the firelight casting shadows across the wooden walls. Echo's silhouette stretched tall and silent, like a guardian carved from flame and silence. Jonas rolled toward the window. Visibility was nearly gone. Snow slanted sideways. The moon had vanished behind a thick quilt of cloud. Then, through it all, a sound. Faint, as if a tiny hand had tapped gently on the door with trembling knuckles. It wasn't a knock of panic, not someone desperate for shelter. It was something quieter, a final attempt from someone on the verge of no longer trying. Echo rose before Jonas could move. His eyes locked on the door, ears upright. He didn't bark, but his gaze shifted from alertness to something else. Unease. Jonas raised his hand. Echo sat. He wheeled himself forward, unlatched the door. The hinge groaned in protest. The moment it opened, the silence outside spilled in, thick and cold. And there she was. A child. A little girl. She looked about 9 years old. Her brown hair was matted with snow and ice. A deep bruise darkened the left side of her face. Her lips were pale, trembling with every breath. The coat she wore was thin, almost useless against the cold. No gloves, no shoes. Her bare feet pressed into the snow, red and stiff, so numb they no longer seemed to feel. For a moment, Jonas wasn't sure if he was seeing something real, or just another ghost conjured by the chaos in his memory. But then Echo let out a low whine, soft, almost a whisper, and stepped gently forward. The girl didn't run. She didn't scream. She just stood there, shaking like a leaf that had held on for too long. Jonas looked down, and their eyes met. Strange, unfamiliar eyes, and yet deeply familiar at the same time. She didn't speak, but in her gaze was a single, silent question. "Can I stay here?" He nodded. He didn't need a name, didn't need a reason, didn't need to hear an explanation from a child who, he knew, couldn't explain why she had to flee her own home. Jonas didn't remember how he lifted her. Since the day he lost the ability to walk, he had trained himself to be careful with every move, twisting, lifting, unlocking, shifting weight. But in that moment, everything he had learned about caution was erased by something deeper than instinct. The need to get her out of the cold, away from the fear that had wrapped itself around her like another layer of skin. She didn't resist. just trembled in his arms like someone who had long stopped fighting back. Jonas placed her in the chair near the fireplace, pulled the thick blanket he used at night from the couch, and wrapped it around her small shoulders. She said nothing. Her eyes stayed on him. But this time, they were no longer asking, "Can I stay here?" They were asking something else. "Is this the kind of place where no one hits children?" Echo stepped closer, quiet as ever. He paused in front of her bare feet, gently sniffed the air around her, as if trying to memorize this new scent. Then, instead of returning to his usual spot, Echo settled right beside her chair. He lowered his head onto her legs and exhaled slowly, resting just as he had done on nights when Jonas was lost to his nightmares. The girl, slowly, for the first time, touched his fur. Her tiny hand, red and swollen from the cold, lay gently across Echo's back. Not forceful, not shaking. As if, no matter how broken she might have been inside, something in her had decided it was safe to rest. At least for a while. Jonas rolled toward the small table in the corner. On it sat the satellite-connected landline phone. His hands moved with quiet precision. The number was already part of him now, memorized like a survival ritual. The signal clicked. A woman's voice answered, calm and official. "Colorado Child Protection Services. How can I help you, sir?" Jonas didn't respond with words. He pressed the emergency signal button 3 times. Then, using the specialized stylus designed for those who could no longer speak, he entered his identification code. The system switched to text input. Jonas typed slowly and deliberately. Child appeared alone in snowstorm. Estimated age 9, visible bruising on face and hands, no shoes, currently sheltered at my home, medical condition stable, request immediate dispatch of field agent. He didn't need to write more. He didn't need to describe her eyes, or the bare feet in the snow, or the sound of knuckles tapping like a whisper from a dying world. A message blinked back on the screen. CPS agent will arrive within 2 hours. Please keep the child safe and warm. Jonas looked up. Echo was still there. The girl still leaned against him, eyes closed now, as if, after years of waiting, she had finally found a place where she didn't need to stay alert. And Jonas, the man who could no longer speak, watched them, holding it all inside the only place left unbroken in him. The heart of someone who had once lost everything, and, for the first time in years, was holding on to something again. They say that when you live long enough in silence, you begin to hear the things others overlook. Jonas knew that better than anyone. Not because he chose that life, but because, somewhere along the way, choice had left him. Since moving into the small cabin near the edge of the Colorado forest, Jonas had grown familiar with every sound around him. The whistle of wind slipping through the roof whenever the northern gusts returned, the dry snap of branches under a deer's hooves at dawn, the steady breathing of Echo as he dreamed beside Jonas's chair. And sometimes, there were sounds that didn't belong, echoes too human. It started near the end of autumn. The house next door, long abandoned for nearly 2 years, suddenly came alive. A young couple moved in, and a little girl. Jonas only saw them from a distance. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes often hidden behind dark glasses. The woman rarely came out, always loading or unloading things from the car. And the girl, Riley, just a brief glimpse now and then. She stood behind the window, her hand pressed to the foggy glass. No wave, no smile. Jonas didn't judge. He wasn't quick to draw conclusions. He had worked in the military. He had seen quiet families, private lives, and all the different shades of silence. Not every one of them was a warning sign. Until the night he heard the scream. It didn't last long. Just a sharp crack through the still air, like something tore straight through it. Brief, Thin, dry, like someone choking on panic. Echo jolted up. Jonas rolled onto the porch, but the lights next door were already off. No more sounds, nothing left but a chill that ran deeper than the cold. A few days later, it happened again. This time it was a thud, then a child's cry. Jonas tried to see through the window, but the makeshift wooden fence blocked most of the view. He checked the audio from the security camera he had mounted. Just wind. And a few muffled words, blurred by fear or by force, he couldn't tell. So Jonas started watching. Not out of curiosity, but because something inside him, a part of survival that had never gone quiet, kept whispering, "That wall is hiding something wrong." He installed another camera, angled towards the narrow path between the two homes. It used to be a shared walkway. Now the weeds were tall and no one walked there anymore. Each night, Jonas watched, flickering images across a dim screen. And each night, Echo lay by his feet, one ear turned toward the wall, as if he too was hearing something Jonas could never quite name. But there was no proof. Every time he saw Riley, she remained silent. She didn't cry. She didn't call for help. She simply withdrew deeper into the house, a faded shadow behind a curtain. No visible bruises, no spoken accusations, no clear signs of wrongdoing that would give the police cause to act. Jonas couldn't speak. He couldn't break down their door and say, "Something feels off." Because in a world of laws and documentation, suspicion meant nothing. You needed something you could hold, record, bleed. And until the night of the snowstorm, he had nothing, just a feeling, one that gnawed at him like a scar beneath the skin, and a truth every surviving soldier knew too well. When your instincts say something is wrong, it usually means it's already too late. There was one truth Jonas Hale had learned since losing his voice. When you can no longer speak, you are forced to look more closely. And when you can no longer act freely, you must choose with precision the one moment you are allowed. His cabin was small, but everything inside it was orderly and strategic. Every corner served as a control point. Each camera mounted on the porch, the side wall, and the roof was set at a cross angle, never overlapping, but enough to cover all directions. He hadn't just installed them to keep wild animals out. He had designed them to keep a vow alive, to protect a small patch of safety for anyone weaker who might one day need shelter. From the monitoring screen in his bedroom, Jonas tracked every movement next door. During the day, it was quiet. Riley either went to school or was kept inside. The foster father came and went, always looking occupied, shaking hands with neighbors, smiling at just the right time, driving a spotless new pickup, playing country music loud enough to drown out whatever else might be happening behind the walls. But at night, when their lights went out far too early, and the only illumination left came from infrared lenses, Jonas often recorded subtle movements. A small shadow crossing a hallway, a fall with no sound, an arm stretching across someone's shoulders. He once tried sending a short video clip to the local authorities. The police responded. "Insufficient evidence. The footage is unclear. No audio to support concern." Jonas knew they weren't wrong. But that didn't make the helplessness inside him any smaller. He had once been the one giving commands. Now he couldn't even say one word. "Stop." His throat, once the channel of orders and strategy, was now just a sunken scar beneath the edge of a scarf. During the first months of recovery, he had tried to scream. What came out was a distorted rasp, like a wounded animal's cry. Doctors told him that partial recovery was possible, if he committed to therapy, relearning how to breathe and vibrate sound upward from the chest. He tried, then stopped. Because for Jonas, a voice only mattered if it carried meaning. And the things he wanted to say now, the world no longer cared to hear. Instead, he taught himself to write with coded signals, adapted a text input system triggered by hand movements, technology once used by medics for soldiers who had lost the ability to speak. He filed his reports through secure channels, linked directly to the nearest police department. But still, the replies never changed. "We'll look into it. Thank you for your information. We're monitoring the situation." Jonas didn't blame them. In a world drowning in noise, people had grown used to ignoring signals that came from silence. Only Echo never missed them. Whenever Jonas stayed awake through the night, watching the screen with tired eyes, Echo's gaze would follow the same direction. Toward that room by the neighbor's window, where a small figure would sometimes drift by, sometimes stand still. Too long, too still. And inside Jonas, an old feeling began to stir. It was the same feeling he'd had when his recon unit entered a ruined village and spotted a child who wasn't crying. Not crying, because they already knew crying wouldn't help. The brick fireplace glowed a soft amber, not bright enough to chase away winter, but just warm enough to hold the sleep of a small soul curled under a heavy blanket. Riley was asleep. Not the sleep of a carefree child. Not the peaceful slumber that follows a day of laughter. This was the sleep of the exhausted, the sleep of someone who had just climbed out of something dark and deep. Her shoulders were still curled inward, a reflex long practiced by someone who knew safety could vanish in a blink. But her breathing, while still uneven, had begun to slow. Her chest rose and fell gently, like someone trying to breathe through dust that had layered over too many sleepless years. Echo lay right beside her, not touching, not moving, just watching. The eyes of a K-9 who had once scanned battlefields from Syrian hills to abandoned farmlands now focused only on a 9-year-old girl, asleep by a fireplace, as if it were the last safe place left in the world. Jonas did not sleep. He sat in the dark, not far away. One hand rested on the wheel of his chair, fingers tightening slightly with each breath, as if willing himself to stay alert. He had seen soldiers sleep like that, in bunkers after the shelling stopped. When the noise outside was over, but inside them, the war had not yet left. And now this girl carried a different kind of battlefield within her. No bombs, no bullets, but the fragments left behind cut just as deep. A small shift. Riley turned in her sleep, her brow furrowing. Echo immediately tilted his head, one ear twitching, then slowly moved closer. He rested his chin on the edge of her blanket. Not enough to wake her. Not enough to interrupt her sleep. Just enough to be there. Like a living barrier no harm could pass through. Jonas watched them and felt a tightness rise in his throat, not from injury, but from memory. Because once, long ago, in a hospital hallway, he had wished someone would just sit beside him like that. Like Echo did now for Riley. No questions, no analysis, no demand to explain, just to stay. On the wall, the camera showed the porch outside. Snow still falling, thicker now. On the screen, a line of digital numbers ticked forward, reminding him that time was moving, and the truth remained hidden somewhere behind that neighbor's wall. Jonas didn't know what he would do, but for now, in a world where action was limited and words were a luxury, he had one thing still whole: presence. And beside him, Echo, who had walked through hundreds of death-defying moments, still kept his silent guard. Eyes open, unmoving, not leaving Riley's side for even a breath. Because sometimes, the only thing that keeps the nightmares away from a child's sleep is the eyes of a dog who already knows. No one gets to hurt her again. The snow hadn't melted by morning. On the wooden roof, Thin layers of ice had settled into cold white ridges. The sky above hung heavy and gray, like a worn-out canvas stretched too far, offering not a single ray of sunlight through its threads. Jonas sat at the table, his tea long gone cold. Echo still lay by the fireplace, his head gently resting on Riley's legs. The girl was still asleep, and for the first time, she wasn't curled in on herself like a folded limb. Instead, she breathed deeply, her eyelids soft and unguarded. The first sound to break the stillness came like a blade across frost. Tires screeched on snow, a sharp halt, then the slam of a car door, hard and final, the kind of sound that told you the decision had been made hours before it was carried out. Jonas turned his head, wheeled toward the porch. Echo leapt to his feet. The man walking toward them didn't look like the image people often imagine when they think of harm. No unshaven beard, no stench of alcohol, just a clean windbreaker, a pale blue tie, and a face shaved smooth. He was Riley's foster father, Robert C. Granger, a sitting member of the local community board. A man who had spoken at charity drives, been interviewed on local radio about family values and justice for underprivileged children. He knew when to speak, when to smile, and what kind of car to drive to make people feel at ease. And now, he was standing on Jonas Hale's porch. He didn't knock. He kicked the door open. "Jonas Hale?" His voice rang out clear and controlled, like the start of a press briefing, not a confrontation. Jonas stared at him, said nothing. "What the hell do you think you're doing? Kidnapping my daughter?" Robert stepped straight into the cabin, eyes sweeping the warm interior before landing on Riley, still deep in sleep. Echo growled. Jonas rolled forward, positioning his chair between the man and the girl, hands locked tight on the wheels like he could hold the threshold together with force of will alone. But Robert didn't flinch. He was used to people backing down. "Call the cops? That's fine. They know me. I'll tell them the kid wandered over and a PTSD-stricken vet, decided to keep her. You won't win this." And then, without warning, he shoved Jonas. The chair jolted back, wheels skidding sideways. Jonas nearly lost balance. Echo, who had been waiting, watching, calculating, launched. But that is where the next part begins. And in the silence that followed, Jonas, the man who no longer had a voice, still tried to speak, with his eyes, saying one thing and one thing only: "You will not touch that child again." The moment Robert shoved Jonas back, the room fell still, as if the entire world held its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Echo didn't wait for a command. He didn't glance over, didn't need a signal. The dog launched forward with the kind of instinct that lived deep in the bone, a reflex that needed no logic, only heart. The first sound was the strike of claws against hardwood, sharp, rapid, final. Then came the startled cry of a man who hadn't yet realized what was happening. Robert had never seen a dog move like that. There was no dramatic snarl, no cinematic growl, just speed, precision, control. Echo's muscular body shot from the fireplace in a diagonal line, not for the throat, as people unfamiliar with working dogs might expect, but straight for Robert's raised right arm. He clamped onto the front of the man's jacket first, yanking it downward, then shifted his grip to the wrist, his jaws locked, not hard enough to break bone, but firm enough to stop movement, to make him back off. Robert shouted, not from pain, but from shock. "I'll sue, you rabid mutt!" Echo didn't move. He held his position, all four paws firm on the ground, eyes locked on Jonas, waiting, not for approval, but for confirmation that the threat had passed. Jonas gripped the armrests of his wheelchair, trying to stay upright. He couldn't call Echo off. He couldn't stop the charge. But his eyes softened. not out of satisfaction, but because he knew some things were still protecting him, just like he had once protected others. Robert stumbled backward, clutching his bleeding wrist. His tailored dress shirt was torn, revealing a deep purple welt beneath the fabric. Echo remained between him and Jonas, unmoving. A barrier, a gate that could not be crossed. A few seconds later, the sound of a car horn broke the air outside. CPS had arrived. A caseworker and a security officer stepped into the house quickly, just as Riley's small figure emerged from the hallway doorway. She wasn't crying. Her eyes found Echo first, then her foster father, the man who had just shouted the word daughter like it was a nameplate on something he owned. "He's not my dad," Riley said quietly. Just one sentence. But it sliced through the mask Robert Granger had worn for years. The security officer stepped forward and motioned to Echo. Jonas gave the slightest nod, a tilt of the head barely visible. Echo let go instantly, no hesitation. He retreated to Jonas's side, standing quietly next to the wheelchair, as if he had not just engaged in a confrontation seconds before. Robert staggered, grabbing the edge of the table to steady himself. The usual confidence in his face had vanished. Only one thing remained. Wounded pride. The most dangerous emotion for a man who had grown used to winning through image alone. "You'll pay for this!" he hissed through clenched teeth, voice trembling. Whether from pain or humiliation, it was hard to tell. The CPS worker, a woman with neatly tied brown hair, stepped gently toward Riley. The girl was still standing behind Jonas, her hand gripping the wheelchair armrest tightly. "Would you like to come with us?" the woman asked softly. Riley nodded. She didn't speak, just looked at Echo one last time, as if to pass along something unsaid. After leading Riley to the car, CPS requested Jonas to sign a temporary statement. He typed it using the device mounted on his wheelchair that converted finger movements into written text. The words appeared slowly on the screen, measured and calm. "I did not detain the child. I opened the door when someone knocked, and I let the dog lie beside her." The worker read it in silence, then signed the document without a word. Robert still stood on the porch. His coat was stained with slush, his sleeve torn. The polished image he had arrived with was gone. But his eyes, they were sharper than ever. He would not let this go. Not for the girl, but because he couldn't stomach the idea of being exposed, especially not by a man in a wheelchair he thought he could bulldoze through. 3 days later, a court summons arrived at Jonas's cabin. The charge, assault with a trained animal. Addendum, potential loss of control due to post-combat psychological impairment. Plaintiff, Robert Granger, community council member, legal guardian of minor Riley Granger. The media caught on fast, and as expected, the headlines the next morning followed a similar rhythm. PTSD veteran attacks citizen, military dog used as weapon. Child removed from legal home, hero or trespasser. From defender to danger, when a soldier fails to leave the battlefield behind. No one mentioned the snowstorm. No one asked why a girl had no shoes in the middle of winter. Only one soul remained unchanged. Echo. He still lay beside Jonas, morning and night, always there. And for the first time in years, Jonas wasn't sure if his eyes could still protect anyone at all. The news broke later that evening. It started with a short post on the Hollow Ridge Town Forum, a place so quiet that even a fender bender could dominate the headlines for an entire week. Former Air Force operative assaults civilian, uses military-trained dog to inflict injury. Within 4 hours, the post had been shared nearly 500 times. The attached photo was grainy, likely taken from a street camera, showing Echo pinning a man in a white dress shirt. Blood visible on the man's arm. No one asked why there was blood. No one questioned what happened before. The headline was enough, along with a few names: Jonas Hale, former soldier; Echo, trained K-9 unit; Robert Granger, legal guardian. That was all it took. By the next morning, the local radio station opened its broadcast with a 3-minute community safety alert. A veteran once deployed in Syria, now living in isolation on the outskirts of town, is reported to have lost control and used a military-trained dog to attack a community council member during an incident still under investigation. The phrase "under investigation" acted like a blindfold, not to shield the truth, but to obscure the reason, just enough to keep the drama intact. By noon, Channel 7 aired a full segment. A reporter stood outside Jonas's cabin, voice steady, expression carefully neutral. Behind that wooden door lives a man once honored for service, now facing criminal charges. Neighbors say he keeps to himself, rarely interacts, and often exhibits unusual behavior. As for the dog, residents describe it as very large and constantly staring at strangers. None of those neighbors had ever been close enough to Echo to know he had never barked unless there was a reason. Still, a so-called expert was brought in for commentary. Glasses with gold frames, voice clinical, detached. We need to consider the effects of PTSD on behavioral judgment in veterans. In many cases, animals are used excessively as protective extensions of unresolved trauma. Jonas didn't finish watching the broadcast. He turned the screen off the moment the anchor began speaking about the need to reevaluate the safety of post-war service dogs in civilian settings. By then, every article written about Jonas carried one common thread. He did not respond. No interviews, no public statements, no appearances before the press. And silence, once seen as humility, became something else under the weight of public opinion. It became avoidance. In a world where everyone feels the need to shout to prove their truth, the one who says nothing is assumed to be wrong. Jonas had no social media, he didn't enable email alerts, didn't own a smartphone, and had no contact numbers saved except for the nearest VA therapy center. Because Jonas had no voice, so he chose to live in places where none was required. But once the news broke, that quiet turned into a pit. And into it came every knock on the door, every message, every headline, falling like stones. No one truly asked, "Are you okay? Was it really self-defense? Did the girl say anything to you?" Number. They asked things that sounded like concern, but carried sharp hooks. What do you think about being labeled dangerous? If you're innocent, why not speak up? Is it true your dog was trained to attack? Would you come on air with us? We'll give you a chance to tell your side. Jonas stared at the letter from a national media outlet, the bold headline gleaming across the top. We want to tell your story, the right way. But what is right for a man who cannot speak, when the entire battle now rests in twisted words? He had once relearned how to shape syllables after his throat surgery, each sound cut from the scar tissue like pulling splinters from flesh. And even after nearly 3 years, his voice remained a brittle thing. Broken fragments, like dry leaves crushed beneath boots. Not something you put on television. The rehab center had recommended voice-to-text software installed in his wheelchair. A mechanical voice to help bridge the silence. But Jonas rarely used it. He didn't hate technology. He simply feared that when his words were read by a machine, people would only hear the machine, and not the man. And now, just as he had once sensed it would happen, people heard only the echo of public opinion, no longer the silence that had a reason. Inside the wooden cabin, the phone rang endlessly. Outside the snow-laced fence, a reporter stood calling through the window, We can help tell the truth. We stand with veterans. Jonas didn't come out. Echo simply stood beside him, watching. Not growling, not barking, just standing, like a shadow that could not be crossed. Each passing day brought newer headlines. The narrative grew hotter with every update. They began to revisit Jonas's military service and asked, have his psychological wounds blurred his ability to discern lawful behavior? Commentators started to shift the tone. We must support our veterans, but we also must ask, when does empathy become blindness? Jonas stopped reading. He sat quietly by the fire, the voice assist device resting beside him, untouched. Because sometimes a person doesn't stay silent by choice. They simply don't know how to speak what no one is ready to hear. Riley was taken away just one day after the first article went viral. No sirens, no warning, just a silver SUV that pulled up quietly at 7 a.m. Nora, the same CPS officer from that night, stepped out. Her eyes held something close to apology when she saw Jonas already waiting by the porch, frost clinging to the wheels of his chair. She didn't explain much, just handed him a printed statement. Due to recent public attention, and in the interest of safety, the child will be temporarily relocated to a protected youth shelter near the city. Jonas nodded. He signed. No questions. Riley stepped outside, still wrapped in the fur-lined scarf he had given her the night of the snowstorm. She didn't look at anyone. Didn't speak. She stopped in front of Echo, placed her hand gently on his head, and whispered something too soft to hear. Echo didn't lick her hand like he usually did. He simply pulled his shoulders in slightly, as if drawing something heavy into himself. A weight with no name. From that morning on, Echo changed. He stopped finishing dinner, didn't react when cars pulled up, no longer asked to go out at the usual walking hour. He just lay there, waiting for something unspoken, but felt deeply. Jonas watched him closely, as if staring at a reflection of something inside himself, because Echo was the first to hear the girl's knock, the first to smell blood beneath her coat. The only other living being, apart from Jonas, who seemed to know. There was something Riley hadn't yet told the world. That night, as Jonas sat in his chair, adjusting Echo's collar strap, his hand paused. A soft sound rose near the door, a sudden, sharp exhale, like someone holding back fear. But no one stood outside. No Riley. Only a closed door and the dark. Echo stepped onto the porch, standing still beneath the eaves, staring toward the dim streetlight in the distance. His ears angled low, his body tense. He was listening to something Jonas could not hear. And in that brief moment, when Jonas placed a hand on Echo's back, he knew. This story was not over, because the truth was still buried somewhere, in silence. And both of them, man and dog, would have to dig it out, with eyes no one believed, and loyalty no one dared understand. Courtroom 3 of Fremont County had low wooden ceilings and fluorescent lights with a yellowish tint, the kind of lighting that made everyone look more tired than they really were. The gallery chairs were covered in old velvet, dark red like a bottle of wine no one had finished. At 8 a.m., the door opened. Everyone stood. Everyone, except the one man who could not and did not need to. Jonas Hale wheeled himself into the courtroom under his own strength. The familiar black gloves clung tightly to his thin fingers. He stopped at the defendant's table, not hunched, not bowed, just still. Echo followed close behind. Step for step. No bark, no growl. He stopped and sat at Jonas's side, spine straight, head slightly tilted toward his handler, as if they had done this 100 times before. In the dim lighting, Echo's black and gray coat nearly blended with the faded military jacket Jonas wore. They looked like one form, a single presence. The judge, a woman in her early 50s with silver hair tied high and a voice that carried without a microphone, began the session with a steady tone, firm and taut beneath the surface like a drawn bowstring. This hearing, regarding the matter of Jonas Hale, defendant, and Mr. Robert Granger, plaintiff, is hereby convened under formal criminal proceedings. Paper shuffled. Pens tapped against wooden desks. At the front row, the prosecutor rearranged her case files. A reporter in a tailored gray suit took rapid notes on a tablet. An older woman clasped her hands tightly in silence, likely family of Grangers. And in the middle of it all was Jonas. No one heard him speak, not because he refused, but because he couldn't. The voice conversion device was placed on the desk before him. It was turned on. But almost no one looked at it. Even if it functioned properly, the synthetic, fragmented sound could never carry the weight of what Jonas truly needed to say. He sat there, gaze forward, posture upright, one hand resting calmly on his knee. Not shaking. Echo remained motionless. The only thing that moved were his eyes, scanning every footstep, every whisper, every shift in the room. As if, in Jonas's silence, Echo had become the ears, the eyes, and, if needed, the voice. Then came the reading of the charges. The courtroom speaker rang out with cold clarity. The defendant is charged with assault resulting in bodily harm using a dangerous instrument, specifically a trained dog. The word instrument made Echo lift his head slightly. No one noticed, except Jonas. He tapped 2 fingers gently against his thigh. A silent signal. Echo lowered himself again, and for the first time since the hearing began, the entire courtroom fell still. Because silence is not always retreat. Sometimes it is the only way to stand, when you cannot stand on your feet. The prosecutor was named Jared Malik, a tall man in his 40s, hair slicked with gel, and a pair of thin, dark glasses that made every glance feel like a verdict even before he spoke. He rose slowly, walked to the center of the courtroom, then turned toward the jury. A faint smile, the kind worn by someone who had argued over 200 cases and had stopped being surprised by any of them. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "today we are not here to judge courage, nor to deny the service of a soldier. We are here to examine an action, committed by a man who, I submit, no longer has control over his own." His tone was smooth, gentle even, but every word he chose was a needle. Malik presented a series of visuals, a photo of the injury on Mr. Granger's arm, puncture marks clearly visible, screenshots of news headlines, veteran loses control, a chart summarizing PTSD diagnoses, legally extracted from Jonas's military medical records. "We are not saying he intended to be violent," Malik continued. "But understand this, someone who has been to war, when cornered, when hearing shouting, arguing, panic, can return to that battlefield." In the mind, he turned slightly, now facing Jonas, then gave a small bow, polite, respectful on the surface. "I do not deny his pain, but compassion must not cloud judgment. Because if we begin calling a bite wound an act of protection, who among us will feel safe opening their door to someone who has seen combat?" In the gallery, a few heads nodded. A young woman covered her mouth, visibly shaken. Jonas made no reaction. He typed a few short lines into the voice device, intending to bring it forward. But the legal assistant gently shook her head. "Not the correct procedure," she whispered. Echo sat upright beside him, posture stiff as stone, his gaze locked on Malik. No growling, no movement. But a trained eye would have noticed the slight tension in his back, an old reflex surfacing whenever someone applied pressure to the man he protected. "No one denies that Jonas Hale was once a hero," Malik concluded, but that does not absolve him of responsibility today. Responsibility, a noble word. But when spoken by the wrong mouth, it becomes a sentence, long before the verdict is read. Jonas didn't flinch. He wasn't trembling. He simply moved very slowly, placing one hand on Echo's head. It wasn't a command. It wasn't reassurance. It was something else. I'm still here, even if they don't hear me. And Echo didn't move either. But his eyelids lowered slightly, gaze deepening like river water before a storm. Mr. Hale, do you have anything to say in response to the charges brought against you? The judge's voice was clear, crisp, cutting through the still air. Jonas looked up. The room went unusually quiet. Even the overhead ventilation seemed to hush, as though giving space to something weightier than sound. Jonas picked up a sheet of paper. He wrote quickly. His hand trembled just a bit, not from fear, but from speed. Speed had once been survival. The letters came out in bold, sharp strokes, black ink, all capitalized. I did not attack, I protected, there is camera. He held it up, but not a single juror turned to look. His defense attorney, a young man recently assigned to the case, was still rifling through documents. He had never worked with a client who could not speak, and he didn't know that Jonas's eyes were trying to speak for the entire courtroom. Echo shifted. He sat closer, head tilted just slightly. A quiet gesture. Jonas tapped 2 fingers against his wheelchair's rim. An old signal, hold position. Echo obeyed. No growl, just focus. The jury began whispering among themselves. A woman leaned to the man beside her. Why isn't he saying anything? Maybe he's avoiding it, the man replied. Or putting on a show. The judge asked again. Mr. Hale, do you have any response? Jonas pointed to the voice device, but the screen flickered. Audio input failed. He blinked once, jaw tightening. Then again, he reached for another sheet of paper. This time, the words were fewer, heavier. I cannot speak, not because I do not want to. Before the message could reach the bench, the prosecutor stood. Your Honor, Malik interrupted smoothly, this is clearly a form of deflection. Mr. Hale has access to legal counsel, has access to technology. Producing handwritten notes, especially at this moment, is nothing more than an appeal for sympathy. Murmurs erupted. Jonas lowered his head, not in shame, but in calculation. He thought about giving the final signal. A small motion, thumb curled, index fingers sliding down the palm, something only Echo would understand. But he didn't. Not now. Not while the room still believed his silence was a tactic. Not while they mistook a wound for a choice. The voiceless are the easiest to misquote. And when someone else's version is repeated often enough, it becomes truth to those who were never willing to listen. Jonas looked straight at the jury, not with anger, not with fear, but with the gaze of someone who had once witnessed bombs fall and was now watching justice collapse quietly. Echo remained at his side. No command needed, no words required. He was the only one left who knew. Jonas wasn't hiding. He simply wasn't allowed to speak like a man anymore. He stepped up to the stand with steady footing, his gray suit tailored down to the stitch. The fluorescent lights above cast a cold sheen on his cheekbones, sharp, pale, and polished. Please state your name for the court. Raymond Granger. Your relation to the victim? I am the legal foster parent of Riley Monroe. From the back row, a quiet cough slipped through the room. Jonas didn't turn. Neither did Echo. Both had long since learned how to separate genuine sound from performative noise. Granger delivered his testimony in a voice that was calm, deliberate, almost rehearsed. That night, I came home late from work. I only intended to pick up the girl, but he blocked me, and then the dog attacked. I never threatened anyone. I didn't do anything." His eyes glanced over Jonas, not with fear, not with anger, but with the look of someone convinced he would be believed. "Have you ever witnessed Mr. Jonas Hale display unstable behavior?" the prosecutor asked. "Many times." He mutters to himself, uses hand signs. "One time I saw him sit for hours in his yard, not blinking. Honestly, it didn't look normal." Then came the neighbors. A middle-aged woman named Lorna, known for selling pies at the local market, an old man who worked the gates at the elementary school down the road. Each of them echoed the same narrative. Jonas was quiet, didn't say hello, sometimes stared toward the Granger house for long periods. I used to think he was just watching the trees, but now it gives me chills. There was this one time I thought I heard him yell. Turned out it was that voice machine of his. Still, felt strange. The defense attorney tried. He really did, but there was nothing solid to counter. No direct contradictions. Just enough uncertainty to plant seeds in the minds of the jury. Echo still sat close beside Jonas, unmoving since the trial began. No growl, no reaction. Until Granger mentioned something almost in passing. "Riley's bag was still there, right next to the sofa. I told her not to leave her things lying around like that." Echo lifted his head. Slowly, his ears tilted toward Granger. His eyes narrowed. Jonas placed his hand gently on Echo's back. A silent touch. Not yet. No one noticed. The jury was focused on one thing. All the people who knew Jonas before said he was different. And in that difference, they had assembled a narrative easy to digest. A silent man. A dog trained to bite. And a burst of violence, neatly packaged inside a word called instinct. The chair to the right, second row, just behind the witness stand, had been marked with a small placard. Reserved, CPS escort. But from the start of the trial until the moment Granger stepped down from the stand, that chair remained empty. No Riley. No thick winter coat she always wore when meeting with the social worker. No light, kitten-soft footsteps like the ones she made during her last visit with Jonas. And no wide, round eyes looking up at him, whispering, "Can you hear me when I don't say anything?" Jonas had nodded. Today, no one nodded back. The prosecutor spoke first, almost as if anticipating the question that hovered in the air. Due to the emotionally fragile condition of the minor, Riley Monroe, Child Protective Services has decided not to bring her to testify today. Facing her legal guardian could cause severe psychological trauma and hinder her long-term recovery. No one objected. No one clapped. Just a silent agreement. As if everyone understood. Sometimes the absence of a child is the most compelling testimony an adult can offer. Jonas slowly turned his head and looked toward that row. There was no note, no voice device, only a gaze, fixed long and still on the empty space, as though if he stared deeply enough, Riley might rise from the void itself. Echo leaned forward. He sniffed the air, an old movement from the battlefield. When soldiers could not see the threat, they entrusted their senses to the dog beside them. But this time, there was nothing. No breath, no familiar scent, no trace of Riley. And that, more than anything, made Echo lower himself again, lying down slowly, eyes wide open, not sleeping, not panting, just watching. The look of a creature who knew the only right thing left was now hidden behind a door no one wanted to unlock. When a child does not appear in court, we must ask, is it to protect the child? Or to protect the adults from the look that child might bring? No one answered. In the CPS report submitted with the case file, there was a line written in blue ink, the handwriting delicate and unmistakably feminine. She speaks very little. But every time she is asked about her foster father, she falls silent, then turns her head toward the door, as if afraid that footsteps might arrive without warning. That line was never read aloud in court. It remained buried, inside a folder no one opened. Like Riley herself, absent from the room where justice was being spoken of, but never truly heard. "And are you certain that every item in your home is accounted for, Mr. Granger?" the defense attorney asked, for the first time finding strength in his voice. Raymond Granger leaned back slightly, lifting the corner of his mouth in a polished smile, the kind worn by men who speak to mayors, not small-town lawyers. "I am a tidy man, Your Honor. My house is not a place for disorder. Riley's bag, I always told her, everything in its place." The moment the words left his mouth, something shifted. Echo, who had been lying silently at Jonas's feet, lifted his head. Not fast, not abrupt, just a deeper inhale. A twitch of the ears, turning toward Granger. Jonas felt it instantly. He looked down, letting his fingers drift across the back of Echo's neck, right where the faded scar from an old battlefield still lived. Echo didn't turn. His eyes were locked on Granger. "Where is that bag now?" the defense attorney pressed. "Still at my house," Granger answered quickly. "It's irrelevant, just some toys from a child who ran out in the night." This time Echo stood. The courtroom stirred. A juror leaned back instinctively. The judge raised a hand. "Order." Jonas gave no command. But Echo needed none. He stepped forward into the center of the courtroom, not quickly, not aggressively. Each step was measured, guided by something deeper than training. Instinct. The same instinct that once led him to a buried detonator behind a mud wall in Syria. A court security officer moved forward. "Restrain the dog." "Wait." The judge's voice cut through the room. She had worked with therapy dogs before, and she knew some reactions could not be trained. "Let him continue." Echo paused. He didn't approach Granger. Instead, he turned toward the side door of the courtroom, where evidence and secondary records were stored, his eyes fixed on a small pink bag with a worn scratch along its zipper. A court clerk followed his gaze, hesitant. "Is that Riley's bag?" Granger froze, then nodded. "Yes, I brought it as evidence. It doesn't matter. Just toys." Echo exhaled. A soft, sharp breath. Not a sound, but a shiver beneath it, like his nose had caught something a voice had not yet dared to say. The judge turned to the clerk. "Bring the bag here." Jonas tightened his grip on his wheelchair rims. Echo looked back at him. A blink. Not a signal. Just a confirmation. Something is about to break. No one saw Jonas move. It wasn't like those moments back in the field, when he'd raise his hand with precision, palm open, fingers signaling the charge, or holding his squad back behind crumbled brick walls. This time, in a room full of people. Jonas moved just 3 joints, one bent, one shifted, one pulled back, shorter than a breath, softer than a blink, but enough for Echo to understand. It was time. He left his position like a ripple in quiet water. No sound, no hesitation. The courtroom had no time to react. They were still wondering whether the dog had even made a sound. Only the judge noticed. She stared at Jonas, not out of fear, but because something had stirred in her, a recognition of a bond no language could explain. "There are only 2 kinds of signals that outlast words," she had once said, back when she was a state judicial aide. "The kind used in war, and the kind shared between someone who nearly died, and the only living creature that never left them." Echo crossed the courtroom floor, stepping past the barrier between counsel and witness. No one stopped him. More accurately, no one knew how to. There had been no order, no call, just a dog moving forward with a purpose that could not be mistaken. To find the truth. Jonas watched him, eyes steady, unblinking. And in his memory, a scene returned. Syria. The day he had been buried beneath rubble after a devastating blast. His throat crushed, air stolen. No voice left to call for help. Only echo had come. Blood in his fur. A limp in his step. He didn't bark. He had placed his muzzle on Jonas's chest and waited for a movement. Their first signal had been Jonas closing his fingers gently around a clump of Echo's fur. After that, they never needed words. They only needed to breathe. Together. And now, in a courtroom drowned in noise, Echo required nothing more than the slightest motion from Jonas to understand. He had once again been tasked with saving something not yet revealed. The small bag, soft pink, worn zipper, a slight tear on one corner, rested at the end of the evidence row. No one had paid it any attention after it was brought in from storage. No one believed anything inside it still mattered. Except Echo. He walked directly toward it. He didn't sniff like a curious pet in a strange place. He assessed. He didn't look for permission, didn't stop to check. Each step was steady. His eyes never left the target. A soft sound, barely there, but it made one juror hold their breath. Echo sat down, his nose touching the zipper. He didn't use his teeth, just one gentle push with his forehead, precise and controlled. The zipper parted, just enough. The first object slid out. A small white inhaler. Its plastic shell was cracked open, spring exposed. Echo didn't react. He simply watched, as if waiting for what came next. And it came. Almost invisible, snagged in the lining of the bag, a broken plastic hair clip, light blue. One side snapped, stained with dried blood. Not the kind of dried blood from a scrape. This was clotted, soaked in, seeped into the grooves of the plastic, the scent unmistakable to a dog trained on battlefield trauma. Echo lowered his head. He didn't bark, didn't growl. He gently nudged the clip forward with his muzzle, placing it beside the inhaler, like two puzzle pieces that had never meant to be apart. The courtroom fell utterly silent. The defense attorney turned toward the judge, ready to speak, but she was already standing, her gaze fixed on the clip and inhaler, not with suspicion, but recognition. "I used to coordinate emergency response," she said quietly, "and I've seen broken clips like that in abuse investigations." No one replied, only the sound of Echo, breathing steadily, as if delivering his final report. Jonas closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them. His hand curled into a fist, not out of anger, but gratitude. "Objection!" The prosecutor's voice rang out, sharp and desperate, clinging to the last thread of control in a room that had quietly slipped beyond her reach. "This so-called evidence cannot be admitted based on the actions of a dog. There is no chain of custody, no validation. Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation intended to sway the jury." Echo didn't flinch. He lay still, beside the two items pulled from a bag once dismissed as harmless. The inhaler and hair clip now seemed to stare back at the very person trying to reject them. Jonas didn't move. His hand rested calmly on his lap. His eyes never left Echo. The judge adjusted her glasses. Her voice was not shaken. It was clear, measured. "You wish to exclude the items, Counselor? I move that they be stricken from the record, improperly introduced, no procedural verification." The judge nodded once, slowly. "Then tell me, what procedure can establish truth more clearly than a dog who once saved hundreds of lives from improvised explosives in war?" The prosecutor had no answer. A young attorney seated behind the prosecutor leaned in and whispered, "She's winning. without even arguing. No one responded. Some of the jurors began to look at Echo with eyes that had changed. He was no longer just the defendant's dog, but a living witness, one who needed neither words nor oaths to reveal what others had chosen to ignore. An officer of the court stepped forward with a pair of latex gloves. "I recommend sealing the evidence." The judge nodded. "Place it in a preservation bag, send it to forensics, and, please note clearly, recovered by Echo, retired K9, under signal from a mute witness of special status." No one laughed, because that formality was earned. The prosecution offered nothing more. But the woman's lips trembled. She knew that what was unfolding here couldn't be rewritten into any news brief she could spin or control. The hair clip and the inhaler were sealed in a sterile bag, labeled with precision. Echo returned to Jonas, as gently as before, with no pride, no demand for credit. He simply sat beside his partner, as he always had. But the courtroom was no longer what it used to be. Several heads began to turn toward the rear, toward the entrance reserved for witnesses. No one called a name. No signal was given. But there was a movement, soft like a shift in the air, that brought silence over the room. Riley. She stood there, beside a CPS worker, holding tightly onto a brown stuffed bear, its edges frayed with time. Her hair was tied back with a strip of faded blue cloth, not a hair clip. A faint bruise still marked her left cheek, not yet fully healed. She didn't come forward. She didn't speak. She only stood, like a crack in the wall no one expected, appearing at the moment the whole room began to freeze. Then Riley looked up. Her gaze moved over the judge, the attorneys, the prosecutor, and finally, Echo. The dog lifted his head. Ears perked just slightly, his expression softened. Riley didn't smile. She only nodded, a small, gentle motion, and the courtroom realized this was not the look of a wounded child. It was the look of a survivor, offering silent recognition that someone had spoken in her place. The judge turned toward the child, then back to the prosecution. "Would you still like to argue the evidence lacks credibility?" No one answered. Even the voice that once dismissed canine testimony now fell silent. Riley took one step forward, and the silence in the courtroom became a testimony more powerful than any spoken word. No one called Riley's name. No one forced her. She simply stood there, just inside the witness entrance, clutching her stuffed bear with both hands, eyes fixed on Echo. The judge turned her head. Her gaze wasn't that of someone presiding over a courtroom. It was something softer, something deeper, more like someone who had once been a mother. "Does anyone object if the child wishes to speak?" No one answered. A silence fell, long, drawn out, like a winter that refused to pass. The CPS worker leaned down and whispered into Riley's ear. The little girl nodded, slowly, gently, as though each nod was a hill she had to climb over. Then Riley walked, barefoot inside her thin canvas shoes, arms still wrapped around her bear. No one moved. Even Echo, still lying motionless at Jonas's side, didn't shift, didn't twitch, but something did move, not sound, not bodies. Something between maybe and never began to lean toward, yes, if you're brave enough. She stepped up to the witness stand. It towered over her. The microphone had been lowered to its lowest setting, but still Riley stood smaller than that. So the clerk brought over a footstool and a chair. Riley didn't sit. She stood. "Your name, sweetheart?" the clerk asked gently. "Riley." "Jane." Her voice was no louder than a breeze slipping through a window crack, but it was real. And for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom heard something that wasn't an accusation, wasn't an objection, but a child. introducing herself. The judge dipped her head, a quiet nod to the courage that had just stepped forward. "Do you have something you'd like to say to the court?" Riley bit her lip. A second passed, then another, a full minute. She turned her head to Echo. He was looking back, those round, steady eyes watching her. No commands, no pressure. "I just want to say, the hair clip is mine." Her voice trembled like the first wind of spring, but it didn't waver. Somewhere in the back, a woman began to cry, quietly, without sound. The jury sat frozen, like statues carved out of silence. Riley remained standing. She wasn't waiting for praise. She didn't need a prompt. She was speaking the words the grown-ups had forgotten. There she stood at the witness stand, small hands clutching the hem of her shirt, eyes lifted, not to the judge, not to the prosecutor, but to Jonas. He sat motionless in his wheelchair, his head tilted slightly, as if listening with every part of his body that still responded. Echo lay beside him, unmoving, but fully present. "The inhaler. It's mine too," Riley said, her voice steadier now. "I have asthma. When I can't breathe, Mom always puts it in my pocket." The prosecutor, seated to the left, shifted slightly, preparing to take notes. But then Riley turned her head and looked straight at her. "But it wasn't my mom who hurt me." The air thickened. Time paused. "It was my dad." A gust of wind struck the courthouse window, rattling the curtain behind the bench. But no one turned. Every eye was fixed on Riley, and Riley looked straight at him. David Rourke, once praised by the media as the model father, had gone pale. His fingers clutched the edge of his seat in reflex. He said if I talked, no one would believe me, that he helped the church, gave money to the clinic, but he didn't just yell, he hit. He stepped on my hair clip. He crushed my inhaler. He said I was weak, and that's why I was sick. One juror raised a hand to their mouth. The court clerk stopped writing, as if what Riley had just said no longer belonged to any official record. It had become something else entirely. Mom just stood there. She was scared. Riley's eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. "I don't want anyone to save me anymore. I just want to say everything Echo found was real." At that moment, Echo slowly stretched his neck forward. He didn't bark. He didn't growl. He simply nodded. A soft, subtle motion. And for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom fell into a silence that felt like reverence. After Riley's words, the room slipped into a quiet beyond description, as though every soul inside it was listening to the echo of their own conscience. Meline, the woman seated in the very back row, dropped her shoulders. No one had called her name. No one had summoned her. But somehow something passed silently between mother and daughter. Riley turned and looked at the woman and nodded. No one ordered her. No one forced her. There was only an unspoken invitation. Meline stood. Her steps weren't rushed. They didn't tremble. It was as if she were descending the very cliff she had built over the years, now stepping down one ledge at a time. When she reached the center of the courtroom, she didn't lift her head. She spoke, quieter than a sniffle. "I know. I should have done something." The prosecutor stirred, ready to interject, but the judge raised a hand. "I knew something wasn't right. I knew from the very first year. I used to think that staying silent would protect Riley, that if I just cared for her enough, shielded her carefully, everything would pass." A single tear fell, soaking into her ash-gray wool dress. But it got worse. I saw how he blamed her illness. I saw the bruises. I washed clothes stained with nosebleeds, and I said nothing. Because I was afraid. Afraid he'd leave me. Afraid the whole town would turn its back. Mylene finally lifted her face, for the first time, and looked at Riley. The girl didn't smile. She didn't look away. I didn't know how to stop him. It wasn't an excuse. It wasn't a plea. It was just the truth. Too late. Riley gave no reply. She simply stepped down from the stand, walked back toward Echo, and once again rested her head against his back, as if that spot was safer than any adult's arms had ever been. The judge sat still in her high-backed chair. The edge of her desk glowed under a flickering fluorescent light, casting its pale hue over a thick stack of files, full of red-inked notes, long transcripts, and endless lines of statutes. But what she saw now was not a legal document. It was a child, a dog, a man who could no longer speak, and a truth that needed no shouting. She didn't speak right away. She only removed her glasses, folded the case file, and placed it aside. I've presided over many trials, she said quietly. I've heard thousands of testimonies, some drafted by lawyers, others by people skilled in hiding the truth. But today, I heard something no record has ever captured. A child spoke. Below, Riley sat quietly beside Echo. Jonas tilted his head slightly, watching not for the verdict, but for the truth that had finally been recognized. This court does not judge feelings, but I do have the authority to delay proceedings when new evidence, especially living evidence, comes to light. In light of everything that just occurred, I hereby declare this trial is temporarily suspended. All charges against Mr. Jonas Hale are to be held in abeyance while a new investigation, specifically into the Rourke household, is opened. I request that CPS oversight teams, local law enforcement, and an independent expert unit work together to review all security footage, gather witness statements, and examine the new physical evidence recovered by the special K-9 witness, Echo. Her voice wasn't loud, it wasn't stern, but each word fell like bricks, rebuilding a foundation long fractured. We cannot redo the past, but from this moment forward, we will listen. No one clapped, no one cheered. Only Jonas's eyes softened, as though a layer of fog had finally lifted. Echo tilted his head, then gently leaned into Riley's legs, as if the longest, quietest watch of his life had finally found someone to take the next shift. The morning after the trial was suspended, snow was still falling, not fiercely, not like the night before. Just soft flakes, quietly covering the gray streets in a silent, steady hush. A silver SUV pulled up in front of the temporary shelter run by the Child Welfare Agency in the northern Colorado mountains. The door opened. Riley stepped out, still holding tightly to the worn backpack she had brought from Jonas's home. She didn't look around, didn't clutch anyone's coat. She just walked, step by step, as if each footfall was asking, "Is this ground really safe?" Janet, the caseworker, was an older woman with salt and pepper hair, wire-rimmed glasses, and a wool cardigan always buttoned to the top. She didn't say much. She simply took Riley's hand gently and leaned down to whisper, "You won't be sent back." "I promise." Riley nodded. She didn't smile, but the tension in her eyes softened. The new place wasn't large, just a compact apartment within a protected housing complex for at-risk children. But for Riley, it had something nowhere else ever had. A tiny bell, hanging by the window. Janet had hung it that morning. She said, "If you ever feel sad, or scared, you don't have to say a word. Just tug the string on this bell, and I'll come." That night, for the first time in weeks, Riley was allowed to keep two things close to her. A wooden bracelet, carved by Jonas from pine, and a faint pencil sketch of a dog standing beside a window, snow falling behind him. No one asked her how she slept. No one pushed her to explain. But the next morning, Janet noticed something. The window in Riley's room was slightly open. The bell was gently swaying, though there was no wind. And on the wooden floor, there were tiny footprints, standing still in the strip of light that slipped through the frame. The official statement was issued that afternoon. No cameras, no reporters, no spotlights catching the face of any spokesperson. Just paper and a red seal. At the top, in bold print, Elms County Court. Final ruling. Acquitted. All criminal charges against Mr. Jonas Hale are fully dismissed. No one read it aloud in a grand courtroom. No gavel struck like in television dramas. Only a quiet court clerk stepped forward and handed Jonas the signed case file. He took it with both hands, as if the weight wasn't in the paper, but in all the silent years it represented. Beside him, Echo tilted his head. He didn't bark. He simply rested one paw on Jonas's thigh, like he once did on the battlefield, when he needed to signal he had found something. Only this time, what he had found was peace. Jonas gave a small nod, not to anyone else, but to himself, as if to say, "There's no need to run anymore." The CPS representative approached, followed by the head of internal investigations. That man bowed his head and spoke quietly. "I'm sorry for how late we were." Jonas didn't react. He simply flipped open a small page in his notebook and wrote slowly, "Late is still better than never." Then he tore the note out and placed it on the table, beside the cleared case file. He turned his wheelchair and left. He didn't wait for another word. Echo followed behind. No sound of paws, no licking of hands, no wagging of tail, just two silhouettes. One man who had lost his voice, one creature who never had one, leaving the courtroom without any need for a victory speech. Within days of the trial's adjournment, the colors on the front pages began to shift, from blaring reds and bold blame to quieter tones and headlines that finally sounded closer to the truth. No one came forward to officially admit they had been wrong. They simply began to write differently. Misjudged veteran, K9 dog uncovers the truth. From silence to justice, Jonas Hale and Echo leave the courtroom speechless. When justice is led by a glance, Echo, gatekeeper of unspoken truths. The first of these stories appeared on smaller independent sites, places where journalists had access to the full picture. And when a video surfaced, showing Echo pulling a blood-stained hairpin from a bag beside the benches, social media erupted. A local news station, once opening with, "An unstable veteran and his dog attacked a father in a suburban neighborhood." Now re-aired footage of Jonas and Echo, narrated with a softer tone. But perhaps, sometimes, silence tells the most reliable story. Online, a still image of Echo standing in the courtroom, the evidence at his feet, was shared millions of times. One user wrote, "The dog said nothing, but he didn't need to. The world listened anyway." Beneath the post, thousands of comments poured in. "I doubted him, and now I'm ashamed of that. I can't believe we nearly turned on the only one who stayed. I hope Jonas sees this. We believe you, late, but sincerely." The community, once stirred by misleading headlines, began to peel back their own doubt. Not because anyone forced them to, but because Jonas, by not lashing out, by not demanding to be believed, by not showing rage, made them reflect. On a veterans forum, a pinned anonymous post read, "I've been there, in the long silence that stretches across years, and I know this. Silence isn't avoidance. It's the choice of those who survived, not to hurt anyone else." Beneath it, hundreds responded, not in words but with quiet emoticons, a wave of stillness that still spoke volumes. As for the press, Jonas gave no statements. He declined every interview. And Echo, still just a dog, was seen only in distant photographs, standing guard at a doorway, walking beside Jonas's wheelchair, lying next to a stack of firewood under the porch. But those images, stripped of spectacle, somehow rang truer than any campaign ever could. People began to retell the story, this time in their own voices: a man who couldn't speak, a dog who never had to, a little girl, and a truth that didn't need to be shouted to be heard. After the acquittal, Jonas returned to the small house at the foot of the hill. No cameras, no banners saying, "Welcome back." Just Echo, lying exactly where he always had, by the door, head resting on his front paws, as if time had never moved. Jonas set the paper bag down, wiped the mist from his glasses, and looked out toward the line of pine trees ahead. The wind stirred gently. The snow had stopped, but the cold still crept in, slicing through the collar of his coat, deep to the bone. Jonas didn't cry. He didn't smile. He didn't even sigh. He simply took out a small notebook from the drawer. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded, the same notebook he had used in those early months after the injury, when his voice was still nothing but broken growls and a throat that burned like salt. On the very first page, a shaky line read, "Echo, if I can't call, look at my hand." And on the next page, he wrote a new sentence, slow, deliberate strokes, as if each word carried its own weight. "I'm not a hero, just someone who couldn't walk away." He didn't plan to send it anywhere, didn't think anyone would read it. But when Echo lifted his head, quietly stepped beside him, and rested his chin on Jonas's knee, as he always did, Jonas understood. Some words aren't written for the headlines. They exist to remind the writer that they still belong in this world, even when the world feels silent. That evening, the former social worker, the one who had once taken Riley away, stopped by. She didn't bring a case file, just said she was passing through, checking in. Jonas gestured for her to come in. She saw the open notebook on the table, then paused at the line. "I'm not a hero." She didn't ask anything. She simply took out her phone, looked at Jonas for permission. He nodded. She took the photo and left. The next day, the sentence appeared in an anonymous post, along with a picture of Echo gazing out the window. Within 48 hours, it had been shared over 3 million times. A handwritten line, a silent gaze, and a man who never left, even when the world had turned away from him. No one ever planned for Echo to become a symbol. He had never been trained to inspire. He didn't know how to pose for cameras. He didn't understand what it meant to be the center of a movement. He just did one thing, stood beside the one he trusted, protecting what he knew was right. And that reached the deepest part of people. The first viral image was a candid shot, Echo resting his head on Jonas's knee. Behind them, a scribbled sentence on a whiteboard. "Justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stay." Then came the video. Echo walking to the center of the courtroom, retrieving the evidence with his quiet muzzle. No music, no effects, millions of shares. People called him many names. The justice dog, the gatekeeper of truth, the sound without words. Online, hundreds of fan artworks appeared. Echo bathed in sunlight through the courthouse window. Echo lying beside a little girl, the caption reading, "You're safe now." On a veterans support site, someone wrote, "I used to think the world had forgotten me, but Echo's image reminded me, someone still stands watch, not for orders, but for the heart." Animal welfare groups, veteran organizations, even schools began to use Echo's image in lessons about courage, empathy, and listening. A group of design students gifted Jonas and Echo a small bronze statue, Echo standing, eyes forward, but one ear tilted back, as if listening to something no one else could hear. They named it Bark of silence. Jonas didn't give a speech. He simply placed his hand on Echo's head and bowed. That day, when they returned home, Jonas opened the mailbox. Inside was a handwritten letter, unsigned. You may not know this, but people like me, who stayed silent because no one believed us, now have a face to call hope. It has 4 legs, and it doesn't need to bark to be heard. Jonas read it again and again, then folded it carefully. He placed it inside the old notebook, beside the first line he ever wrote to Echo in the days after coming home from Syria. That night, Echo lay beside the fireplace. He didn't sleep. He just stared at the door, as if he knew. A new chapter was beginning, and this time, it wouldn't just be Jonas and him. There would be others, forgotten ones, those who once believed their voice had no worth, who would find their way back through the eyes of a dog, who had once, quietly, done the most right thing. Jonas didn't keep a single cent from the donations. Even when a media representative hinted at a book deal, when journalists asked about the rights to his story with Echo, he simply nodded in gratitude and quietly shook his head. He didn't want to sell what had once saved his life in exchange for money or fame. Instead, he wrote 3 words on a blank piece of paper. Silent duty. At first, it was just an idea, a quiet hope scribbled beside a photo of Echo, still wearing the lean harness from his military days. But soon, messages began to flood in, from veterans, from their families, from strangers he'd never met, asking, "Can I send my husband there? My son used to be a soldier. Now he doesn't speak at all. I want to help. I'm a retired veterinarian." Jonas understood. This place needed to exist, not as a center, but as a gathering point of light, where those once left behind in the shadows of war, memory, and silence could begin again. He used every dollar of the donations to purchase an old ranch on the northern outskirts of Colorado, about a 20-minute drive from the nearest town. Far enough to stay undisturbed, close enough to be reached, even in a wheelchair. The wooden gate was rebuilt. There were no signs, no slogans, just a small wooden plaque carved with quiet precision. Silent duty. We do not speak for you. We will stand beside you. There, with a small team of volunteers, mostly veterans, doctors, and former military dog trainers, Jonas began rebuilding from the frozen ground up. They constructed kennels, designed a special training zone for those who could no longer speak. They created a curriculum using only hand signals, eye contact, and tactile responses. Every dog trained here wasn't meant to perform. They were trained to accompany. No flashy slogans, no polished uniforms. But everyone knew. In the silence each returning soldier carried, there was always a cry that had never been spoken. And sometimes what they needed wasn't therapy or medication. It was a pair of eyes willing to wait, a breath that did not judge, and a dog who would stay, no matter what. No one ever gave Echo an official title. There were no medals pinned to his collar, no speeches, no spotlight ceremony. But everyone who came to silent duty knew Echo was the gatekeeper of hope. During the very first training session, as the veterans sat in silence, each one bearing a scar, a memory, or a fracture too deep to name, Echo didn't walk around to greet them one by one. Echo lay quietly in the center of the dirt courtyard, head lifted, eyes scanning the circle. Then he walked slowly toward the oldest soldier in the group, a man with only one arm, his eyes sunken behind thick lenses. Echo sat down beside him, without a bark, without a touch. He simply kept watch. That man, 73 years old, had not slept through a single night in over 2 decades. But that evening, for the first time, he drifted off. His chest rose and fell gently next to Echo's warm body. The next morning, he said just one sentence. I don't know what he understood, but he heard things I never dared to say. From that day on, Echo became the interviewer without questions for every new arrival. Whenever he approached someone, the others knew. That person needed presence more than any technique. Not every dog at the center played a role like his. Many were still in training, each with a temperament of their own. But Echo was different. He no longer needed training. He was the embodiment of what they were all trying to build. Loyalty without reason, protection without command, listening without words. In the small wooden office behind the meditation garden, there was a hand-drawn sketch hanging on the wall. No signature, just dark pencil lines showing Echo standing under the shadow of a soldier, both gazing toward a snow-covered hill. Beneath the sketch, a scrawled message. Silent replies, but never silence. Each time a new group of veterans arrived, Jonas would begin the session by writing that same line on the whiteboard. He never read it aloud. He would just tap the board once, then let Echo walk forward. That gesture, repeated across every training cycle, slowly became the opening ritual of silent duty. And each time Echo entered, eyes that once held nothing but dullness began to glimmer. Not because he was a special dog, but because they saw themselves in those eyes that had waited, had hurt, and had stayed. Echo didn't lead. He didn't stand on any platform. But no one entered silent duty without remembering the image of him lying still beneath the wooden eaves, ears perked, as if listening to the kind of silence the world had long forgotten. Because here, he wasn't just a symbol, he was a language for all the things that had never been named. They came quietly. None of the first veterans who arrived at silent duty carried much. Most brought only a canvas bag, a few personal items, and a gaze heavy from years of being avoided. Some had served in special forces, others in combat medical units. There was even a former military nurse, left mute after a landmine blast, her ocean-colored eyes still sharp, her voice permanently hoarse, incapable of calling even her own name. They didn't come because they believed. They came because there was nowhere else left to go. Medical centers had turned them away, stating no further functional recovery. Families didn't understand the midnight terrors. The public only remembered them during memorial broadcasts once a year. So they came, not hoping to heal, but wondering if any place might still accept them when they were no longer useful. The first morning was always cold. The Colorado air seeped into their bones, especially those carrying wounds in lungs or joints crushed by war. Jonas didn't speak when greeting them. He simply gestured toward the wood-burning hearth. Echo was often the first to approach. Some wept, quietly, without warning, as if the dog's gaze pierced places no therapist had ever touched. Others sat frozen, needing 3 days before forming a full sentence. And some burst out laughing when handed a rubber ball. 15 years. I haven't held one of these in 15 years. They began to train again, not for combat, but to relearn how to exist, how to walk slowly on grass without flinching at sudden noise, how to reach out and touch a dog's back without being ambushed by memory, how to sit beside another human in silence and not feel the need to speak in order to be seen. One young soldier, just 27, shattered after his unit was ambushed, once wrote in a journal, "I came here thinking I was a shadow, but Echo showed me that even a shadow needs light to exist." Soon after, those who once believed they were the leftovers of war began tidying up the grounds, planting trees, sharing medication, teaching each other how to breathe through the panic, and one by one, in their own way, they began training dogs. No words, no voices, just a breath that never gave up, a hand that never pulled away, and a dog willing to lie beside them through the night, just to guard a sleep they no longer believed they deserved. From a shelter, silent duty became a community. No one called themselves a patient. No one claimed the title of hero. They were simply people who had once lost their voice, now learning to speak again by learning to listen deeper. And in the little house by the pines, there would always be a dog waiting. That morning was crisp and cold, a typical December day in Colorado. Flecks of snow still clung to the windowsills of Riverside High, where the school had just concluded its Veterans Week with one final quiet gathering. There were no grand banners, no flashy posters, just a brief announcement over the morning PA system. Third period today, Auditorium A, special guests, former Special Operations Officer Jonas Hale and his dog, Echo. Not many students recognized the name. Though his story had once appeared in newspapers, it wasn't exactly the kind of thing that held their attention. Not at that age, when interest was often reserved for the dramatic, the rebellious, or whatever was currently trending. And what was so special about a man in a wheelchair, accompanied by an old dog? Yet, when Jonas was rolled into the center of the auditorium, Echo walking beside him like a breathing shadow, the entire room fell silent. No one had asked for quiet. There was no bell, no command. It was simply that their presence had a gravity that made everyone stop. Jonas halted his chair just before the small stage. Echo didn't follow him up. He lay down beside the wheels, as though used to staying outside the spotlight, but never outside the moment. A teacher gave a brief introduction, a few short lines about battlefields, injuries, and an organization called Silent Duty. Then she stepped back, leaving the space to him. Jonas didn't stand. He couldn't. He didn't take the microphone either. He didn't need to. Instead, he opened a notebook resting on his lap and flipped to a printed page. On it were the words, "Hi, everyone. I can't say much, but Echo can." He looked down. Echo raised his head, as if understanding. Jonas tapped his fingers twice on his leg, an old signal. Echo stood up and stepped onto the stage. He didn't perform. He didn't do tricks. He simply walked down the aisles, gently pressing his nose into the hands of each student. The room remained silent, but not from curiosity this time. Something else was being felt, something that didn't need language. And then, one student whispered, "We're listening," in a different way. No lecture echoed through the hall, no slides, no chalkboard notes. The only thing moving was Echo. He walked between the rows like a quiet breeze, one that didn't muss your hair, but made everyone turn their heads. A boy sitting near the door stared at his worn-out sneakers, eyes downcast, avoiding all contact, until Echo nudged his clenched hand. The boy flinched. Then, slowly, he opened his fingers. Echo didn't ask for treats, didn't beg to be petted. He just stood there, silent, steady. A girl in an oversized hoodie, dark circles under her eyes from too many sleepless nights, tried to avoid the teacher's gaze. But when Echo came close, she looked up. For the first time that morning, something softened in her expression, as if she had finally been seen for something no one else had noticed in a long time. At the center of the room, Jonas remained still. He didn't write, he didn't move, he just watched and smiled, a small, fleeting smile, the kind that comes from someone who has grown used to the kind of silence that deserves to be heard. A few students in the front row began whispering to each other. Not to joke, but to ask, quietly, the kind of questions they didn't know how to say out loud. "He's not speaking, but I understand. That dog feels like someone I always wished I had in my life. I don't know why, but I feel like it knows I've been sad before." No one mentioned war. No one spoke of trauma or diagnoses. And yet, somehow, Jonas and Echo had already done so, in the quietest way possible. A teacher quietly wiped their glasses. A librarian stood near the back doors, clutching a notebook so tightly their knuckles had turned pale. A boy from the sports team, normally loud and full of swagger, now sat completely still, his hand resting on his thigh, eyes following Echo the entire time. There was no need to retell stories from the battlefield, no need to reopen wounds, no need to show emotional videos. All it took was Jonas sitting there, and Echo, walking with calm steps, as if moving through every unspoken sorrow in the room. This session felt unlike any lesson before. There was no discussion, no debate, no raise your hand to speak. Not until Echo returned to Jonas's side, laying down as before, his head gently leaning against Jonas's leg, did the room begin to stir again. A student furrowed their brow, as if trying to grasp something that no textbook had ever taught. Then, a girl slowly raised her hand, very gently, almost as if asking the room for permission just to speak. The teacher nodded. She stood up. Her long black hair fell over her narrow shoulders. Her oversized jacket nearly hid her hands. Her voice was so quiet that if the room hadn't already been holding its breath, no one would have heard her. "Mr. Jonas, may I ask a question?" Jonas looked at her. He nodded softly. His eyes held the kind of attention that didn't need words to be understood. "Echo." She glanced at the dog resting nearby, then back at Jonas. "Does Echo know what justice is?" The entire auditorium paused. Not because the question was too big, but because it was so real. A question adults often answer with definitions, laws, and philosophy. But here it came from a girl who may not have learned any of that yet. Jonas didn't respond right away. He looked at Echo, who was half dozing, but with ears still tilted slightly, listening. Then, slowly, Jonas opened the notebook on his lap. He didn't write immediately. Instead, he looked up at the girl, eyes asking something unspoken. "Are you sure you want to know?" She nodded. He picked up his pen. Every stroke came with silence. Every sentence carried the weight of something he had perhaps wanted to say for years. But no one had asked, not at the right moment. When he turned the page towards the audience, there was a single sentence written, "Number." But he knows how to sit in silence with someone who is hurting, and sometimes that is justice, in its warmest form. Echo lifted his head, as if he felt something had just been said for him. The room remained utterly still. The girl who asked the question looked at Echo again, then back at Jonas, her curiosity now replaced by gratitude. No one pushed for another answer. No one waited for a grand speech. That question, "Does Echo know what justice is?" had already found its answer in the silence that followed. Jonas looked around the room. Faces still young, maybe naive, but far from indifferent. In their eyes wasn't admiration for a hero, but attention for someone who was wholly present. He smiled. A real smile. Not polite or rehearsed, but the kind of smile that rises when something true and beautiful has finally been seen, and no longer needs to hide. He turned towards the chalkboard and reached for a stick of white chalk. A fine layer of dust covered the board. Maybe no one had used it in years. But today, it would hold something that couldn't be easily erased. Jonas wrote slowly, each letter large, rounded, steady, easy to read, and easy to feel. Number. But he knows how to sit in silence with someone who is hurting. He paused, then continued, and sometimes that is justice, in its warmest form. The whole room seemed to hold its breath. No applause, no laughter, just a deep, dense quiet, and something inside each chest beginning to soften. Echo remained still, but his tail gave a soft thump on the floor, like an unspoken agreement. The girl nodded. She had understood. A boy near the back set his phone down. Not because anyone told him to, but because he didn't want to miss what was happening. A teacher standing beside him placed a hand over their heart. Quietly. No words. Just presence. Jonas set the chalk down. He didn't look back for praise or approval. He simply reached down, placed his hand on Echo's head, and nodded, a small gesture. But to everyone there that day, it was the most complete answer they could have received. The snow had melted. Spring in Colorado wasn't exactly radiant, but it was gentle enough for people to start opening their windows in the morning. In the small back room of the Silent Duty Center, Jonas was sorting through training files when the letter arrived. Not by email, not printed, but handwritten. The handwriting tilted slightly, soft as the first breeze of the season. There was no clear return address, just 2 opening lines. To Mr. Jonas Hale, the man who taught the world that silence also speaks. Jonas paused. He unfolded the letter. Inked lines, dark and light, intertwined like emotions too long held back. I am a single mother. A car accident took my voice 3 years ago. I can still write, I can signal, but people no longer have the patience to understand. My son, he's 8. Lately he's become quiet, withdrawn. I found out he's being bullied at school, but I can't scream. I can't protect him in the way he needs. They told me to take him to therapy. But I saw your video, the courtroom, the little girl named Riley. I saw Echo. I just want to ask one thing. Can I learn how to let a dog understand my heart? Jonas set the letter down on the table. In front of him, morning light slanted through the window, casting soft shadows across Echo's back, the shepherd still half asleep after a long day of training. He didn't need to think long. He didn't need to search for words. In that gentle light, Jonas understood, the question wasn't asked to be answered. It was searching for a door, a place where someone wouldn't be pushed aside just because they no longer had a voice. Jonas didn't respond right away. He left the letter on the desk, beside Echo's old military collar, the one still etched with his former service number. The room was quiet, but not empty. Every corner, every photograph on the wall, every shifting shadow as the light moved, all whispered stories of people who once came here with fractured hearts and tired eyes. They weren't looking for pity. They were just hoping someone would stay. 3 days later, as early sunlight brushed softly across the porch, Jonas reached for a fresh sheet of paper. His handwriting was steady, firm, nothing ornate, but filled with a quiet strength, like a calm breath at dawn. You don't need a voice. You only need a living being willing to stay with you, even when the world no longer believes you. Not because it understands everything you've been through, but because it won't walk away when you no longer have the strength to explain. If you're ready, we are here. Not to teach you how to command, but to help you relearn how to be heard. He folded the letter and tucked inside a black and white photo. Echo standing beside a former soldier, a man who once couldn't bring himself to touch another living creature after the war. In the picture, those same hands now rested gently on Echo's head, and Echo, as always, simply lay there, silent but understanding. Jonas sealed the envelope, placed a stamp, and dropped it in the mailbox. No need for a return. No bold name on the outside. He only hoped, if that letter reached her, and if there was a child somewhere behind a window watching and waiting for a sign that the world could be safe again, then this place, Silent Duty, would be the beginning. The sky darkened, as if the afternoon slowed down to make room for something quieter, something deeper. Jonas sat on the old wooden porch of the little house, the one that had once marked the start of a journey back to life. Beside him, Echo lay still, his head resting on Jonas's left foot. The fireplace inside crackled gently. Its light spilled through the window, stretching into a golden band that wrapped around them like an embrace that needed no movement. Echo didn't sleep. His ears remained perked, his eyes half open, not out of fear or vigilance, but because he was waiting. A quiet waiting without command, name, or purpose. Just the instinctual rhythm of a soul who had once guarded the threshold between life and death, and was still doing so. Each tiny sound, the fall of a dry leaf, the breeze slipping through the fence, the gentle beat of wings against the roof, made Echo tilt his head slightly, as if conversing in a language no one had ever taught him, but one he had known long before learning how to bark. There, beside Jonas's feet, he was no longer just a dog who once saved a man's life. He was a part of what had never been spoken aloud. He stood as a symbol for those who had lost their voices, yet still found the courage to stay. Jonas leaned down, resting his hand gently on Echo's head. No signals, no glance exchanged. Echo closed his eyes, not because he was tired, but because he trusted that if any cry for help ever echoed through the night again, he would hear it. As the last light of sunset spilled across the porch, the shadows of Jonas and Echo stretched across the steps, blending together as if they had never been separate. And in that quiet place, without a podium, without laurels or applause, a man without a voice and a dog with no need for words were still there, still guarding a trust that had never truly disappeared. Because some doors only open when someone is patient enough to sit outside and wait. And some calls can only be heard by those who listen with their entire being. The story of Jonas and Echo was never about greatness. It was a story of perseverance, of a man who had once lost everything, and of a dog who never left. They never fought to be recognized. They simply stayed, silently, steadfastly, in a world still filled with doubt, where silence often weighed more than noise. The German Shepherd, known not just for its intelligence or strength, but for something far less teachable, the heart of a creature who chooses to stay by a human's side, even when no one asks it to. Echo embodied that loyalty, a living proof of connection beyond words, of healing born from wounded souls. In a world that often shouts too much, sometimes what we need most isn't advice or logic. It's a quiet presence, a pair of eyes that never stop watching, a breath that remains, even when we tremble, when we break, when we no longer have a voice to call our own. Because, as Echo reminded us, there are doors of trust that only open when someone is willing to wait just outside them. The sky above the federal base that day was cloudless, just an endless stretch of blue, cold, and unnervingly still. The wind drifted across the barbed wire fence, past towering antenna masts, then paused at Training Ground 4, where one creature stood completely motionless. No whining, no barking, not even a blink. Valor, a German shepherd with a powerful build, low frame, wide shoulders, sun-scorched coat. But it wasn't Valor's muscles or stance that caught attention. It was the eyes. Eyes that couldn't be trained. Eyes that held something almost human. Not rage, not aggression, just awareness. So sharp, so precise, that everyone around the field fell silent. As if they weren't watching the dog was watching them. Elias Quinn stepped out from the command room, his silver-gray uniform pressed crisp without a single crease. The man wasn't large, didn't speak much, rarely smiled, but the way he pulled on his gloves, tied his boots, then made a simple gesture with one finger to Valor said everything. No whistles, no verbal command. Valor moved like a shadow, a streak of gray cutting through the field. He bolted from point A to point B, hurdled 3 obstacles, paused just once to avoid the clack of a simulated mine trigger, then shifted course without hesitation. As he scaled a wooden wall, his hind legs barely touched the surface, just a light push, and his whole body soared like a living arrow. The second he landed, Valor dropped into a crouch, ears forward, eyes locked, awaiting the next signal from Elias. There was no signal, just a glance, a tiny tilt of the head from Elias, and Valor understood. He pivoted, retraced his steps, bypassed 3 hostage stand-ins without touching a single one, then halted in front of a black duffel suspected to be an IED. He sniffed twice, then let out a single bark, short, sharp, and surgical, like a blade cracking down on steel. A lieutenant watching from the sideline furrowed his brow, said nothing. But everyone's eyes turned to Elias, then quickly looked away. Like they were used to this, and maybe a little afraid of it. At the Federal K-9 Center, the highest tier of national K-9 training, no one didn't know Valor and Elias, a silent duo, unbreakable, a man who didn't care for politics, a dog who didn't need adjusting. They weren't in the media, they weren't in the annual commendation reels. But anytime a situation was flagged, urgent K-9 required, their names were the first ones tagged in the internal logs. And there was one more thing, something only Elias and Valor knew. The 12th signal. The center taught 11. Attack, guard, lead, detect, each tied to a hand sign. But the 12th? That was theirs. A soft touch to the collar, followed by a retreat of the hand. Not written in manuals, not taught to anyone else. That signal meant, if I go down, you finish the mission. Alone. And that day, after a routine drill, as Elias turned to walk back inside, he quietly touched the collar of his uniform. Just a fraction of a second. But Valor saw. Inside storage room 3 of the Federal Center, flickering fluorescent lights reflected off stacks of sealed files printed in silver ink. Elias removed his gloves, placed them on the cold steel table, and opened a red sealed folder marked, "No electronic record allowed." It wasn't a file that bore his name, but his fingerprints were everywhere inside. First page. 5 disappearances in 8 months. All were whistleblowers, all scheduled to meet with Agent Elias Quinn. All vanished before the meetings happened. Elias sat down, slowly flipped through the pages, like retracing memories that weren't supposed to be his. Some notes were blacked out. Some photos had corners sliced off. Some names were reshuffled, but somehow he still recognized them. Every curve of handwriting, every familiar face. The tiny details only someone from the inside would know were fake. His finger stopped on one report. The last line read, "Recommend this case be reclassified under behavioral risk." No further investigation. Underneath, a signature Elias would never forget. Sawyer Vance. Sawyer. A man Elias once called his brother. They had shared over 10 missions, survived an ambush at the southern border, pulled a kidnapped child out of a running incinerator together. The change didn't happen overnight. It was slow. Subtle. First came the double-edged remarks, then the private calls Sawyer never explained. And finally, a summons. A meeting with a special review group. When Elias declined, the reason noted was lack of cooperation. That meeting, held in a darkened conference room where a strip of yellow light barely touched the table and the camera was taped over with black cloth, ended with an offer. "You've got skills, connections. If you're open to transferring to behavioral analysis, we can make it happen. All we ask is that you stop digging into things that aren't your responsibility." Elias didn't respond. He just stared at the teacup in front of him, the water long cold, and remembered the firm handshake of a female witness he once protected. She had told him, "I still believe not everyone in the force is the same." The next day she vanished. The note in her file read, "Relocated. No notice given." Elias closed the classified folder, tucked it into his coat, and walked out of the storage room. No one looked up, but he knew He had crossed a line there was no coming back from. When he returned to his temporary quarters, Elias didn't turn on the light. He sat down beside Valor, the dog already lying low near the door, ears perked, never once disengaging from watch mode. Elias lowered his hand onto Valor's head. No stroke, no comfort, just a firm placement. Like someone sealing a decision with no return. Valor didn't flinch. He just inhaled deeply. Then exhaled. Outside, the shift change lights on the tower started blinking. A faint metallic scent drifted in through the cracks of the door. Inside that silent room, a man and his dog, without exchanging a word, both understood. The battle ahead wouldn't come with backup. No cover from command. No favors for those who refused to stay quiet. There was only one thing left worth protecting. The truth. And if it came to that, they would protect it alone, at any cost. The raid happened on a sunny morning. Special ops, rapid response, and a few federal agents were mobilized urgently. An anonymous tip had flagged a suspected logistics hub for illegal human trafficking, somewhere on the outskirts south of Houston. Elias was assigned to the operation, not as a lead, but as an additional unit. A strange designation, but he didn't push back. He brought Valor, didn't question it, didn't resist. But in his inner pocket, he carried a copy of a confidential internal investigation report. The convoy stopped near an abandoned complex. Sunlight cut across cracked concrete and boarded-up windows. The air was thick, moldy, tinged with the burnt scent of scorched wiring. Elias stepped down, hand resting gently on Valor's head. A gesture. Familiar. Reassuring. Or maybe a signal. At 9:36, the breach order was given. A blast took down the front door. First through was a tactical officer. No name tag. The second wasn't Elias. 1 second passed. Then another, and then... The explosion hit, not inside but from behind the building. Windows shattered. Shockwaves tore through the perimeter. Shards of wall became shrapnel slicing through the air. The entire structure trembled and collapsed like a beast shot in the heart. Valor was the only one who ran toward the blast. No barking, no hesitation, just a straight line, guided by instinct, by the scent of human skin mixed with gunpowder, and something else only Valor could sense. A void. The unnatural silence of someone who should be there, but wasn't. 10 minutes later, the entire team was pulled back due to risk of further collapse. A roll call was taken. 6 wounded, 3 unaccounted for, and 1 name stopped the entire command center cold. Elias Quinn. Nobody, no signal, no footage, just Valor, dragged from the wreckage while still clawing at the debris. Front legs bloodied, dust caked on his face. His right ear was torn. But his eyes hadn't changed, still asking, "Where is my handler?" A week later, an internal report was circulated. Cause of explosion: accidental electrical fault. Elias Quinn. Missing in action. Case closed. And Valor? After stitches and a brief neurological review, he was removed from active K-9 duty. The final report read, "Emotional trauma may compromise operational stability." A transfer form was pre-filled. Destination: a retirement kennel in North Texas. On the file, beneath current status, typed in bold Arial 12, no longer fit for service. Below that, a blank box, a space reserved for the name of a new adopter. No one asked Valor what he wanted. No one questioned why, since being separated from the base, he had refused to eat, refused to sleep, refused to respond to any command. Only one person ever understood him, and that person was gone. From that day on, within federal records, the name Elias Quinn bore a red stamp. Missing. And the name Valor erased, nowhere to be found. 5 years later, Houston had changed. Not in the way the trees now shaded the streets or how the shopping districts glowed all night long. No, the change lived in the empty spaces. In forgotten lots no one asked about anymore. In old buildings sealed off with faded yellow tape, their original warnings long lost to memory. Places that no longer showed up on city maps, but were still known by name among the veterans, the ones who carried memories no one else dared to touch, and quietly called these ruins home. That's where Elias appeared. As if he had never belonged anywhere else. His hair touched his shoulders now, streaked with silver where black once ruled. His beard grew in uneven clumps. One shoulder slumped lower than the other, like it had long since accepted the weight it carried alone. In the tangled crowd at the Monday morning food station, Elias didn't stand out. But somehow, nobody ever forgot him. They called him Doc. No one knew exactly why. Maybe it was because he once saved an old man who collapsed with seizures in the middle of the street. Or maybe it was how he'd quietly removed a syringe from the trembling hands of a young soldier slipping into addiction, never asking questions, never expecting thanks. Elias never spoke about his past. All he carried was a busted military watch with no minute hand and a small notebook tucked under his coat. Every night, once the upstairs pipes stopped leaking and the city held its breath in the lull between midnight and dawn, he'd sit beneath a flickering bulb and open that notebook. Each page was filled with clumsy lines, faces he remembered, tiny details he refused to forget. A birthmark beneath the left ear, a wedding ring missing its stone, a final sentence spoken before they vanished. These were the witnesses, the ones Elias had sworn to protect. Now he lived for one purpose only, to stay alive long enough to find the truth. No revenge, no reckoning, just a name. His name, etched somewhere in a memory that hadn't yet been erased. Up in North Houston, where fog mixed with factory soot like smoke from a dying cigarette, Elias rented a room in a housing unit for retired veterans. He had no papers, no ID. So he used a different name, Caleb Ford. No one questioned it. People living there weren't the kind to pry. They nodded at each other in the morning, shared painkillers when the nights got cold, and let silence fill the rest. One morning, as Elias passed by a repurposed church now serving as a relief center, a young woman approached and handed him a damp piece of paper. "You should keep this. People with dogs ask about it," she said, then turned and walked off. The ink had smudged from rain, but one line still stood out, printed in bold. Found, German Shepherd wandering near industrial zone, microchipped. Name, Valor, currently held at County Rescue Station. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't speak. He just stood there perfectly still. Then slowly, he folded the paper into quarters, tucked it inside his jacket, right next to the notebook. No one knew he didn't sleep that night. No one saw him dig out an old, creased map of the city, the last one that still marked the location of the county rescue station before the funding cuts erased it from official records. Every red dot on that map had once meant something. A clue, a trace, a thread in a tangled web. But that night, Elias looked at only one thing. One name. Valor. And like a machine, long thought rusted beyond repair, his spine straightened. Not out of hope, not out of belief, but for one simple reason. If Valor was still alive, then nothing was truly over. Across town, on the other side of Houston, where white picket fences still stood straight and the grass was always trimmed just right, Valor lay stretched across the sun-warmed steps of a red brick 2-story house. It was a bright day. Sunlight slipped through the canopy of red maples, dancing across the dog's thick coat. creating golden streaks like strips of sunlit ribbon melted into fur. Inside, an older man gently wiped dust from a row of medals framed behind glass. His name was Richard Yates, a retired major whose voice was always low and calm, but whose hands trembled every time he bent down to tie his shoes. Beside him stood Emily, his wife. Gentle, soft-spoken, and the kind of woman who often placed her hand on her husband's shoulder not to guide him, but to hold him, in case the world slipped too far away. It was Emily who adopted Valor from the county shelter. When asked why she chose a dog flagged as behaviorally depressed, she answered simply, "Because those eyes didn't need explaining." Since arriving at his new home, Valor had never once torn anything up, never growled, but also never stayed still for too long. Every night Valor would rise from his bed, make a quiet round through the house slowly, softly, then return to his spot, head resting on his front paws, eyes not quite closed. One evening, as Emily flipped on the evening news, a faint police siren echoed through an old clip in the background, barely audible. Yet Valor stood up instantly, ears erect, body tense like a drawn bowstring. No barking, just a stare, locked onto the screen until the sound faded completely. Afterward, Valor walked out to the porch and sat under the steps until long after midnight. Richard once chalked it up to leftover instincts, until the day he put on his old uniform to take a photo for his 40-year enlistment anniversary. At that moment, Valor turned away. Not leaving the room, not hiding, just not looking. The way Valor stayed quiet, it wasn't the silence of a dog learning how to trust again. It was the silence of something waiting for a signal that hadn't come yet. The last time Richard took Valor for a walk through the neighborhood, they passed a parked patrol car near the Veterans Memorial. The siren let out a short burst, just a test tone, and Valor froze mid-step. Back arched, jaw clamped shut, tail low, his eyes sharpened into that of a trained enforcer, exactly the way federal canine reports once described dogs operating in hostile zones. In that instant, Richard understood. Inside Valor was a memory never erased. Not because no one had tried, but because it never got closure. When they returned home, he didn't mention it to Emily. He just quietly opened an old drawer and pulled out a brown leather collar. The stitching was worn thin and faintly. You could still make out the hand-carved initials. V-Q. Valor approached and sat down. Richard held out the collar, not to put it on, but just to show him. And in that exact moment, Richard was certain of one thing: the light in Valor's eyes, the one that had been gone since the day they met, flickered back to life. Not bright, but enough. Like a signal light pulsing through a fog no one had thought to look into. It wasn't hope. Not yet. But it was a beginning. That night, in a dream, Valor bolted upright, startled by a sound no one else could hear. No sirens, no voices, only something his mind had stored deep down. A familiar movement, a slight tilt of a head, and a voice one he knew like his own heartbeat. "Hey, buddy." Across the city, in a cramped room on the third floor of a weathered tenement, Elias sat motionless in front of a laptop with half its keys missing. The glow of the screen cast a pale blue light across his face, outlining the fresh creases carved by another sleepless night. On screen, the surveillance footage looped. A hallway, a lobby, a black SUV pulling up to a red line. Inside the vehicle, Sawyer Vance, once the man who'd stood shoulder to shoulder with Elias under enemy fire. The man who once said, "I've got your back." Now, he was a symbol, a sanitized idol of truth and order. Every time Sawyer stepped out of the Homeland Security building, at least 3 reporters waited. Camera flashes followed. Headlines praised him. Federal officer leads fight for truth. Elias didn't look at his face. He focused on one detail, Sawyer's hand holding a small brown leather wallet. He'd seen it before. He'd given it to him. Not for the wallet itself, but for what he'd hidden inside. A micro SD card, tucked beneath the lining during their covert operations in El Paso. That card, if it still existed, held a recording of a phone call between Sawyer and an unnamed official. A conversation outlining the plan to filter internal witness reports. It had been Elias's last ace, but the explosion had stolen his chance to retrieve it. And now, it sat in the hands of the man who could rewrite history. Elias couldn't get close. Every route near Sawyer was under surveillance. Facial recognition systems still had Elias flagged. A single glimpse of his face, even in a side mirror, would trigger a security cascade across federal networks. He'd already tried once. A small cafe near the local news station, where Sawyer always stopped on Thursday mornings. Elias arrived 10 minutes early, took the back corner seat, cap pulled low, fingers wrapped around a cold ceramic cup. Then he saw them. 2 plainclothes agents walking past the glass, earpieces in. Didn't order anything. He left. No hesitation. No trace. He knew. Sawyer knew. They were playing chess, but only one of them owned the board. Back in his apartment, Elias opened the worn notebook. He started a new list. Internal data access points. Underneath, he scribbled time slots, supervisor names, behavioral patterns, anything that could crack the system from the outside. This wasn't an investigation anymore. It was survival. And Elias knew one slip, and he'd lose his last advantage. He wouldn't just disappear. He'd be processed, just like the witnesses before him. Every day, he tracked Sawyer from a distance. It felt like watching a reflection of who he used to be, a man carved into perfection. But Elias knew, behind the press conferences, behind the clean suits and polished smiles, there were shadows. Meetings without transcripts, trips with no record, deals sealed in silence. He didn't need to expose it all. He just needed a crack, enough for the light to break through. And Elias believed, no, felt, that somewhere across the city, another pair of eyes was waiting too. Eyes that had learned to wait in the dark. A 4-legged heart. That had never once forgotten the 12th signal. That afternoon, the skies over Houston were neither sunny nor stormy. Clouds drifted quietly above, and the roads below shimmered faintly, recently rinsed clean by the early morning rain. Elias had just left the community food station, cradling a small paper bag with a few canned goods and a loaf of dry barley bread. Under his worn jacket, the brim of a cap shaded his face, and he moved through the crowd like a shadow, unnoticed, unremarkable. At the corner near an elementary school, it was dismissal time. Children's voices filled the air, overlapping with the long screech of a bus brake, then silence, then another screech. A faded yellow school bus rolled to a stop, its front tire kissing the edge of the crosswalk. The doors opened. One by one, the kids began to step off. Elias stood across the street. He wasn't planning to stop. But then, a sharp scream. A boy, maybe 7 years old, had slipped free from his mother's grasp and darted back into the street, chasing something he'd dropped. At that exact moment, a smaller bus approached from the opposite side, its driver blind to the child's path. The bigger bus had blocked the view. Elias didn't think. His body moved before his mind could speak. The paper bag hit the concrete. He shot across the street, foot sliding over wet paint, shoulder brushing the side mirror of the parked bus, and then dropped low, arms scooping the boy in a swift, tight hold. The other bus passed just inches behind them. Tires screeched, people yelled, the mother sobbed, screaming her child's name, Elias didn't hear it all. He only felt the boy clutching his chest, trembling. He gently patted the child's back. 2 light taps, then a pause, a rhythm, a code. Then he knelt, set the boy down safely on the curb, and instinctively tilted his head to the left, a gesture so subtle it might have gone unnoticed, and spoke in a low, steady voice, meant not for strangers but for someone who'd once known. "Hey, buddy." A bystander caught the whole thing on a phone. The 14-second video hit social media within 30 minutes. The title was simple: "Homeless Man Saves Child from Oncoming Bus." But it was the 9th second, the frame where Elias turned his head and spoke, that stopped people mid-scroll. Because that wasn't how strangers spoke to children. That was how someone once gave orders, in absolute trust, to a warrior trained for the unimaginable. That evening, across town in a quiet neighborhood in the north, Richard was watching the local news replay the clip. Emily was in the kitchen washing dishes, not paying much attention. But beneath the coffee table, sprawled out, half asleep, lay Valor. The moment the video reached the frame with the words, "Hey, buddy," Valor shot upright. No growl, no bark, just stillness. Ears are stiff, eyes locked on the screen, as if the whole world had narrowed into one pixel of memory. Richard saw it, set his glass down, said nothing. Valor stepped closer to the TV, his body tense, his gaze focused, not on the screen but into it, as though he were confirming something that couldn't be smelled or heard, only remembered. Emotion, a tone, a single buried signal. The clip played again. Then a third time. Valor didn't blink. Emily walked in, about to say something, then stopped. Because the look in Valor's eyes wasn't fear, wasn't alertness. It was recognition. In that quiet living room, sunlight spilling over an old sofa, the TV looping the same 14 seconds. Something ancient and buried stirred back to life. Valor moved. Not toward Richard, not toward Emily, just away, down the hallway. He passed the small bedroom where a brown-haired girl sat sketching with a crayon. She looked up as Valor's claws clicked across the floorboards. She opened her mouth to call him, but the door had already tapped lightly against the wall as it swung open. A low, strained rumble came from Valor's chest. Not violent, not angry. It was the sound of something held in for 5 long years, now spilling out in one single breath. A sound not made for ears, but for the air itself, a signal, sent out like an SOS no one had asked for, but someone might still hear. Emily called out. Richard stood. The girl rushed to the doorway, crayon still smudged in her hand. But by then, Valor was already gone. Down the porch, over the fence like a ghost in motion. No pause, no hesitation. Just a single direction, the one from the video. The path wasn't short. Valor had no handler, no GPS, no address, but canines like Valor. They didn't follow maps. They followed the memory. Breath. And the one thing that couldn't be taught, couldn't be stolen. Loyalty. Valor tracked the faint traces left behind by the footage. The dust on the pavement, the tang of steel from the wheels, the scent of Elias soft in the wind, scattered but real. As Valor sprinted past the edge of the park, a man out walking his dog reached out to grab the brown leather collar, but missed. Moments later, an animal control officer was dispatched to the scene. By the time she arrived, there was nothing left but a trail of claw marks etched deep into the dirt. Richard jumped into his car. Emily was already dialing every rescue center in the county. The little girl cried, her unfinished drawing clenched tightly in both hands. "Valor never stays away from me this long," she whispered. But what none of them knew was that Valor hadn't left them. Valor was returning to the only soul he had ever been taught he must never, ever lose. The shadows in Houston grew longer. Street lamps flickered one by one. And beneath that pale golden glow, a gray figure moved along the painted lines of the road. No barking, no hesitation, no glances to the side. That four-legged heart was chasing a signal no one else could hear. No one but him. Valor's gait wasn't smooth. His stride uneven, a limp in his back left leg still lingered from that explosion years ago. But not once did he slow. He tore through cracked sidewalks, crossed unmarked intersections, cut through streets so long forgotten they no longer appeared on the city's digital maps. But Valor was not lost. Every turn, every alley, a memory stirred awake. An abandoned lot where Elias used to train him in hand signals, crouched behind rusted metal drums. A sandwich stand they once took shelter under during a sudden downpour. A three-way junction beneath a highway overpass, the last place Elias had tightened Valor's collar with bloodied hands, whispering something through sirens and the stench of burning nitrate. Valor passed all of it. No pause, no second glance. He wasn't chasing the past. He was reclaiming the present. An hour in, the wind sharpened. Cold crept in from the north. With every breath, white fog puffed from Valor's mouth like steam from a machine long thought broken, but now roaring back to life. A group of teens on bicycles caught sight of him. One started to speak, but none dared get close. There was something in the way Valor moved, a silent authority that made them instinctively step back. That gaze was back, not the gaze of a dog once labeled unfit for duty, but the gaze of a warrior. The same eyes that once scanned smoke and flame, read the flicker of enemy movements, and waited for wordless commands from the only human he had ever answered to. On the wall of an old storage depot, faded red paint still spelled out, "A place untouched." That's where Valor stopped. Not because he was tired, but because of the smell. Blood. Old, but real. It was faint, hidden beneath a layer of dust and the oil-stained scent of truck engines, smeared across the textured concrete wall like a memory someone tried to bury. No one else would have noticed. But Valor did. He lowered his snout, nose grazing earth, eyes half closed as if summoning a ghost from deep within. Then they snapped open icy sharp. He had the trail. And somewhere down this road, Elias wasn't far. This was no longer a chase, no longer an escape. This was a journey home. Just as Valor took his first steps onto that fading scent trail, another signal lit up. This time from a government server buried beneath Houston's central administrative tower. A facial recognition algorithm had completed a match. 81% certainty that the man in the viral video was Elias Quinn, a missing internal operative. Within 8 minutes, an encrypted alert was sent across silent tactical channels. No public alarms, no routing through official oversight. Just a single command. Capture alive. Interrogate off record. And at the bottom of that command, the signature of one man, Sawyer Vance. At that moment, in a sterile meeting room on the 16th floor of the Department of Homeland Security, Sawyer stood at the window with both hands clasped behind his back, eyes cast down toward the city like it was a chessboard. And every piece had been moved exactly where he needed it. No one in the room questioned the order. The name Elias Quinn had long been purged from public systems. No one knew he'd once been honored as Community Liaison Agent of the Year. No one knew his disappearance coincided with the vanishing of 3 key whistleblowers from an internal counterintelligence unit. Only Sawyer knew, and Sawyer never forgot. He turned from the glass, lifted a still warm cup of coffee, and spoke with all the gravity of a man reading weather stats. "Keep it quiet, no press, No surveillance feeds. Containment site. Pick a remote facility. Then he paused, lifted his eyes. And what used to be the eyes of a trusted partner were now so cold it was hard to tell if what stood there was man or mechanism. Interrogate off record. I want this cleaned up. That night, when Elias returned to the old shelter to retrieve a notebook, he felt it before he saw it. Not movement, not shadow. But silence is too perfect to be natural. Before he could reach the door, a floodlight snapped on. Blinding. Unforgiving. Then came a voice, low, familiar from behind. Hands off your body. Kneel. We know who you are. Elsa frozen. He couldn't see their faces, but he didn't need to. He recognized that cadence, that sharp edge in the air when power cloaked itself in the absence of noise. Slowly, he lowered his arms. Deliberate, controlled. But his eyes, they drifted, as if trying to memorize something. The wind's direction, a trace of smoke in the distance, the rhythm of boots on pavement. Because Elias knew if he didn't make it back, there was one who would never accept the silence. One who had never abandoned his post. Elias didn't resist. When the cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he didn't protest, didn't plead, didn't even look at the agents flanking him. His eyes stayed locked forward down a short corridor toward an open door. As he stepped across its threshold, he turned his head once, not to look back, but to check something one last time. A worn section of wall to his left, 6th brick from the bottom, where he'd once hidden a paper scroll. It was gone. Elias exhaled. A soft, weightless release, like letting go of something he'd made sure to pass on before time ran out. All through transport, Elias carried only one possession, a tattered notebook wrapped in faded canvas. No one noticed. No one searched it. Because from the outside it looked like junk random codes, broken lines, sloppy left-handed scrawl, water stains, wrinkled pages. But inside was everything Sawyer couldn't touch. A memory encrypted in trembling strokes, a map in private shorthand, and in the center, one folded page guarding a single golden hair. From Valor. The vehicle veered off civilian routes, steering through industrial zones. No sirens. No escorts. Elias was taken to a decommissioned military bioresearch station on Houston's far eastern fringe. The iron gate swung open without a sound. Figures in black moved in and out, their uniforms bare of any insignia, their presence as ghost-like as the institution they served. Every step echoed off concrete, a slow, deliberate rhythm that made it clear. This place had been built not just to confine bodies, but to bury stories no one was meant to retell. Elias was nudged forward, into a square room. No windows, fluorescent light so white it stabbed the eyes. On the table, a glass of water. The chair, raw steel, its legs scorched, as if someone before had tried to resist and failed. He sat. The notebook stayed on his lap, unopened, unhidden, just held. He didn't look up when the far door hissed open. He didn't have to, because the voice always came after the footsteps, because that stare, the one that strangled the air out of a room, never asked permission before it entered. Sawyer stepped in. White shirt, crisp, gray tie knotted perfectly, a thick envelope of documents in his right hand. But it was his left hand that mattered. A handgun, silencer attached, the kind that never echoes. Elias lifted his head, and for the first time in years, those two pairs of eyes met in the same room again. No shock, no rage, no why. just silence, the kind that grows teeth. Then Sawyer smiled. But it wasn't a smile you could name. It had no edges, no meaning, just a crack in a mask. At that exact moment, outside the facility, the wind shifted. Rain began to fall hard, sudden, punishing as if the sky itself had been holding its breath and could no longer wait. Valor reached the ridge above the compound. From there, the lights of the outer perimeter painted the walls below in strips of sterile white. No warmth, no soul. Valor didn't bark, didn't move. He just stood there, a statue in the rain. As if something he had waited 5 long years to find was finally within sight, yet still out of reach. The wind carried scents, motor oil, worn leather, old gunpowder. The sour rot of damp walls never touched by daylight, and threading between them, faint, fragile, was another scent. Familiar skin, dried blood from an old explosion, a trace of disinfectant Elias always hated but had to use. Valor stepped forward once, then sat. Ears sharp, eyes locked on the concrete ahead. No one noticed the muddy dog outside the fence. Not in a city where conspiracy wore clean suits and power flowed through wires no one could trace. But if anyone had stood close enough, they would have seen it. In Valor's eyes, there was no fear. Only the order. The one given long ago in another night, another war, when Elias had whispered into his ear, "If I don't come back, you wait." And Valor was waiting. Not like a dog left behind, but like a soldier, assigned his final mission. No breach, no attack, no chaos. Just wait, because of some wars. Aren't won with teeth. They're won with trust. Inside the room, the door shut behind Sawyer with a low, solid sound, the kind of sound metal makes when it strikes the scar tissue of memory. There was no bright light. Just a faint strip spilling down from a vent in the ceiling, cutting across Elias's face like a dull knife that still managed to sting. No recorders, no observers, just the two of them, once brothers in arms, once comrades through fog-drenched winter drills, once the kind of men who pulled each other out of hell without needing to speak. But now one is standing, one sitting, and no longer on the same side. Sawyer stepped forward. His footsteps echoed off the cement like a slow metronome, ticking through the decay of decency. Elias didn't look up. His hand rested on the weathered notebook in his lap, thumb brushing the frayed edge like it was a switch he needed to touch, not to prepare, not to panic, but simply to remember that something still belonged to him. Sawyer stopped, leaned forward, one hand on the table, and spoke. "You know why I'm here?" His voice was gentle, almost soft, like a doctor asking permission before delivering the final injection. Elias looked up. That gaze, the one that once trusted Sawyer, once shared stale cookies on overnight stakeouts, now held only one thing: acceptance, not of death, but of what Sawyer had become. "I know," Elias answered quietly. "You can't stand the idea that someone is still alive." Sawyer chuckled, a smile without shape, without pull at the corners, but his eyes, those changed. They shifted like metal catching the light, eyes of someone who had torn down the wall between idealism and power, between protection and control. "You don't get it, Elias," Sawyer said, taking the seat across from him. "I don't hate you for surviving. I hate you for remembering." Outside, wind slipped through the cracks in the wall, dragging thunder and the tapping of rain across the roof. But inside, the silence was sealed like a heart waiting for its final beat. "You should have let it go," Sawyer said, setting the silenced pistol gently between them. "We both should have." Elias didn't look at the gun. He didn't even look at Sawyer. He asked just one thing soft, almost delicate, but it shattered the quiet like glass under a boot. "Did you ever forget valor?" The room folded in on itself. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead, as if the question stirred something electric in the bones of the building. The gun sat still. Its shadow stretched across the edge of Elias's cloth-bound notebook like a dividing line between two memories. One still bleeding, one long rusted shut. Sawyer smirked again, but this time something flickered. A tremor behind the eyes. "Valor," he repeated, swallowing it like gravel. He was just a dog, a piece of equipment. Elias nodded slowly. "Like me?" The wind slammed against the barred window. The steel rattled faintly. Sawyer looked up, then back, and now his gaze didn't drift. It held, a mirror, one side reflecting the pride they once shared, the other revealing a pit Sawyer had fallen into so slowly he never noticed the descent. "You're siding with something that can't protect you," Sawyer muttered, his fingers drifting closer to the grip of the gun. "I sided with survival." Elias was silent. Then, "I sided with the one soul who'd come back for me, if I was betrayed." Sawyer let out a graveled laugh. "And what's the price for that?" Elias didn't answer, because at that moment the rain said everything. The storm outside had thickened. It beat against the building like it was trying to scrub the truth off its walls. Sawyer picked up the gun. Not in haste. Slowly. His finger stroked the barrel as if it were memory itself, remembering the last time he'd held it in the name of justice. He turned it, letting the muzzle settle just above the table. "You're not leaving this room." Elias exhaled. Not in defeat, not in fear. Just a breath from someone who had already seen the bottom. "I know. I don't need to walk out of here. I just need one signal." Sawyer frowned. "What?" Elias met his eyes fully, finally. "If you speak, Valor will know I'm alive." 1 second. Another second passed. In that fragile silence, Sawyer's finger began to squeeze the trigger. And in that exact moment, the door behind him burst open. No slam, no alarms. Just a whisper of wind against cold steel, swinging the door as if it had finally given up trying to hold back what was always meant to arrive. A shadow lunged through. No hesitation, no flicker of doubt. The snarl that followed tore through the room, not like any sound a human being had ever heard. It wasn't the cry of a frightened animal, not a predator's roar. It was the sound of a loyal heart erupting from 5 years of silence. Valor. Soaked in rain and mud, fur tangled and dripping, eyes burning hot like forged iron. The coat that had once been brushed smooth was now matted with street dust and storm water. But none of that mattered. Only the eyes mattered locked on Sawyer's hand. The hand holding the gun pointed at the only person Valor had ever accepted as his. It all happened in the space of a heartbeat, but every witness who later retold the moment remembered it the same way. The first growl came like the sound of steel cracking behind a wall. Valor launched across the room. No arc, no slowdown, a direct line through the years of waiting. And he didn't aim for the weapon. He aimed for the wrist gripping it. Sawyer turned too late. The second sound when teeth sank deep, straight into the tendon. The gun hit the floor. Blood splashed across Elias's notebook, soaking into the fabric cover like ink on memory. Sawyer screamed, not in pain, but terror. The kind of scream a man makes when something pierces his belief that he was untouchable. Valor slammed him to the ground, front paws on his chest, eyes never blinking. He didn't bite again. He just held him there and growled, not like a lion, not like a wolf, not like anything you could find in nature. It was a sound that had waited 5 long years to be heard, full of hurt, full of defiance, full of something ancient and unbreakable. A sound that made the hallway outside tremble. The door swung wide. Security teams flooded in, flashlights and shouts. "Stand down!" someone yelled. But no one fired. No one moved, because something sacred was unfolding before their eyes. A man in cuffs, motionless, lips trembling, a dog torn and trembling from the road standing between him and every threat in the room. Elias lifted a hand, touched the top of Valor's head. Valor didn't turn, but his tail gave one soft wag. No commands, no names, just return. And in that moment, in that room, that corridor, that cold and blood-slicked government building, only one truth existed. Loyalty. The kind you can't earn with medals. The kind you can't buy. The kind that survives rain, violence, silence, and time and still comes back when you need it most. Wounded. Soaked. But unshaken. The gunshot cracked through the room that very instant. The first bullet missed it, sliced into the edge of the steel table, sparked off with a flash, then ricocheted near Elias's foot. The second, closer, sharper, punched straight into Valor's shoulder. But Valor didn't stop. Not a cry, not a stumble, not even a flicker in his stride. The force of his leap sent Sawyer crashing backward, his chair tipping as he hit the floor. The gun skidded toward Elias, but he didn't move. He just reached out and shielded Valor's head as blood began to bloom from beneath the thick fur. No one in the room breathed. Valor pinned Sawyer down with the full weight of his body, one paw pressed into his chest, the other clamped the wrist that had held the gun. Valor's eyes were fixed, but not wild, not panicked, not crazed. He was just doing the one thing he was born to do. Protect. Sawyer squirmed. He screamed. But the sound was drowned in Valor's growl, low and steady, echoing off the metal walls like a memory with teeth. That growl didn't roar. It didn't rage. It just reminded the room of something no one dared admit. If you betray the ones who once believed in you, don't expect to escape the eyes that once looked at you with trust. Elias pushed himself upright, wrapping an arm around Valor's neck, steadying him. Blood seeped fast, soaking the fur around his chest, mixing with the rainwater still clinging to his body. "Valor," Elias whispered. But Valor didn't look back. He stayed locked on Sawyer, like if he moved even a breath too soon, the past would find a way to repeat itself. And this time, there'd be no one left to come back for. A crackle buzzed through a radio in the hallway. Footsteps thundered down the corridor. Officers poured into view. Flashlights flared. Hands hovered over holsters, but Elias raised a hand. "Don't." No one moved, because at that moment, everyone saw something no training ever prepared them for. Protection, not born from orders, but from memory, from every battle fought side by side, from every silent night filled with quiet nods and trust passed in a single touch on a dog's collar. Valor began to tremble. His legs gave out slowly, but he stayed over Sawyer, holding him down with sheer will. Elias leaned forward, wrapping both arms around him, pressing Valor against his chest like letting go would mean losing him to a darkness they couldn't return from. The blood kept coming. From the shoulder, from his side. Maybe a bone shattered. Maybe a vessel hit. But Valor's eyes stayed open. And in a fleeting moment, those eyes turned to Elias. No questions, no pain, just checking, to make sure the other heartbeat was still there. Elias touched his forehead to Valor's. "It's over," he breathed. "You did it. Let me handle the rest." One exhale, no one knew if it came from the dog or the man. But in that small metal room surrounded by blood and betrayal, steel and loyalty, two beings said everything without saying a word. Then Elias lifted his gaze toward the officers frozen at the door. His voice cracked, but it was firm. "We need a medic, right now." One long pause. No one spoke. Some still had guns trained on Elias. Others kept their flashlights on Valor's blood-soaked frame. A few were just trying to process what they were seeing. Then one man stepped forward. The deputy commander of Houston's Special Security Division. His brow furrowed, as if he were looking through the veil of time itself. Through the overgrown beard, the tired eyes, the worn jacket. He blinked, and then came the words, "Oh God." "That's Quinn. Elias Quinn. No ID needed, no biometrics." That name, scrubbed from every official database, still lived in memory, in briefing rooms, in classified missions, in whispered tales of integrity. And now, that man, once the moral compass of an entire generation, was sitting on a cold concrete floor, holding a wounded dog, blood running through his fingers like a truth long buried. A command broke through the tension. "Weapons down! Call a medic." Suddenly the room snapped into motion, organized chaos, but not one person stepped too close to Elias. They moved around him, circled wide, as if he and Valor were surrounded by something sacred. Sawyer was still on the floor, one arm pinned, blood seeping from the torn flesh on his forearm. He looked up at Elias, for the first time in years. And there was no pretense in his eyes anymore, no role to perform, no superiority to hide behind. Just silence. Then he turned his head away. A young officer entered. She hesitated, cuffs trembling in her hands, voice uncertain. "Sir, you're being placed under arrest pending investigation." Sawyer didn't resist. He rose quietly, allowed his hands to be bound, and was led out like a ghost who'd lost its weight. Elias didn't watch him go. He only held Valor tighter, as if with every second passing, part of his own warmth was slipping away. The gurney rolled in. A medic knelt down and touched the blood-matted fur. She started to speak, then stopped. Instead, she gently fitted an oxygen mask over Valor's muzzle and clipped a heart monitor to his side. The first beep came through, faint, slow, but steady. Someone whispered, "This dog jumped in front of 2 bullets." Another voice followed, stronger. "Not to attack, to protect." The air thickened. Someone stepped out to make a call to command. No one disturbed Elias. Not one person asked questions. They simply watched from behind doorways, down corridors, from across the threshold, as if something hallowed was unfolding. His hand lay across Valor's neck, stroking gently down the spine, each pass slower than the last, each touch like trying to hold on to a piece of breath drifting into the wind. For the first time in 5 years, people in that building began to ask themselves the real question. Who was the traitor? And who had always been the soldier? No one said a word. The echo of Valor's growl still clung to the walls. The scent of blood, gunpowder, and rain-soaked fur became a memory none of them would be able to shake. Outside, the rain began to fall harder. The medical wing sat at the far end of the old compound. Officers and medics moved back and forth, too busy to pause but always glancing back to the open doorway, where a man sat on the stone step and a dog lay limp in his lap. Elias didn't ask for a private room, didn't request a bed. He just sat there, lowering Valor's head onto his thigh, shielding his body with the thin jacket that had seen too many years. Blood still seeped through the makeshift bandage, but Elias didn't wipe it away anymore. because he knew this time was better spent staying close. His fingers, once steady with a weapon, once unwavering on signed orders, now trembled as they stroked Valor's spine. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured, not sure if he was talking to the dog or himself. Valor shifted, barely. One ear twitched, just enough to show he was still listening. Elias looked into those eyes clouded with rain, edged in dried blood and fading light. Then, with a voice almost gone and a breath tangled in the wind, he said, "Good boy." His hand tightened, softly, so softly not to hurt. "You found me." A gray beam of light slipped through the overhang. The rain still fell, but it had gentled now like the sky itself was grieving too. And in that wet haze, Valor, too weak to open his eyes, wagged his tail. Once. Not hard, but enough. Elias closed his eyes, one hand still around Valor's neck, the other pressed to his own chest, a signal no one ever taught him, but one he'd carried inside him for years. There was no applause. No one approached. But in the way every eye held the scene from afar, one truth was undeniable. That man was not alone. And that dog was not just a dog. He was a witness, a brother in arms. The last symbol of loyalty the world had forgotten is loyalty that doesn't live in files or medals, but in every scar, every step, every look, and sometimes in the final breath, whispered in the middle of a rainy afternoon that no one needs to hear to feel like the earth itself has been shaken. The next morning, the rain had stopped. But the grounds of the Rehabilitation Center for Former Intelligence Officers still shimmered with dampness, as if the night's silence had soaked into the soil and hadn't quite let go. Elias sat by the window. A white hospital blanket hung loosely around his shoulders. Beside him, a small table with nothing on it but a glass of cold water and a single notebook. Covered in faded khaki fabric, its edges frayed and corners worn from years of holding on. It was the only thing Elias had asked to bring when he left the detention facility released, under conditional supervision, with mandatory psychological monitoring. Not because his body was wounded, but because someone had decided that a man who had survived 5 years underground, after an explosion allegedly erased his memory and sanity, should be watched more than listened to. Elias didn't argue. He simply sat there, fingertips tracing the stitched edge of the notebook's cover, the same way he used to run his hand along Valor's spine every night, slow, steady, never rushed. The curtain fluttered softly. Sunlight spilled across his hand as Elias opened the first page. No title, no preface, just a list. Written by hand, names, dates, and 2 small marks beside each entry. A circle meant someone had gone missing. A slash meant confirmed dead. Elias turned page after page. And every time he paused, he read the name softly, like summoning an old friend. Someone who used to laugh in the hallway, walk past biometric scanners, sit across the table during morning briefings, or once held a leash attached to a dog like Valor, before disappearing without a trace. There were no graves for them, no funerals, only whispers buried inside the system. Reassigned, early retirement, went AWOL. But Elias knew. No one left willingly. They had been erased. And now, those names everyone lived again in ink soaked with sweat, rain, and blood. His hand stopped near the back of the notebook. One name had been crossed out repeatedly, like the writer had tried to forget, but couldn't. It was the name of a woman, an agent, the last person who had believed him, who had tried to send a classified report just before everything collapsed. Elias lifted his gaze. Out the window, a few other patients were practicing their steps on the back lawn. A little farther off was a small garden. And under the shade of a maple tree, a figure lay still. Valor still there. He couldn't stand yet, but his eyes were open. Not alert, not in pain. Just calm, as if to say, "Go on." Elias looked back down at the page. A blank one. He pulled a pen from the pocket of his patient robe. The ink still flowed. His hand still trembled slightly. But the script somehow held its shape. The first line he wrote, "Those who haven't been named." And then he began to write, not like a report, not like a condemnation, but like a vow witnessed by the steady eyes of a German shepherd lying in the sunlight, one ear twitching and a heart still beating. Valor was moved to a specialized recovery wing, a small room beside a garden, tiled in soft ivory, with a window that opened eastward where morning light spilled in like an unspoken greeting. He couldn't stand yet. The wound across his chest was still wrapped. One of his front legs was stabilized in a soft brace. But his eyes were still the same. Not shattered. Just the gaze of a being that had learned how to face pain without barking, without panic, without running. Every morning, Elias came and sat by the window, reading aloud from his notes. He didn't need anyone to hear, didn't expect anyone to respond. But once, when he spoke the name of someone they'd served with during the Iron Bridge operation in 2021, Valor stirred. His ears twitched. And Elias knew Valor still remembered. That whole morning, Elias didn't write anything new. He just sat there, his hand resting gently on Valor's head, thumb stroking the bridge of his nose. With every touch, memories flickered to life, not in order, not with logic, but vividly. A red clay training field, the whistle of command drills, boots striking dirt in sync. Elias Younger, buzz cut, uniform still crisp, stood tall, signing with his hands, a specific gesture used only when voice contact was compromised. The only one who understood that signal was Valor. There was a moment during a simulated mission when Elias slipped from a metal rooftop. No one reacted fast enough. But within seconds, Valor had leapt from the top of a shipping container and shielded his handler's body, growling at the others until Elias pushed himself up and gave the all clear. It was irrational, but no one blamed him, because only Elias gave Valor orders, and only Valor understood that collapsing didn't mean defeat. Sometimes it was a signal not for retreat, but for something else, something quieter, something deeper. Every gesture was a story. A blink, a long whistle, a soft tap on the belt buckle. They had once communicated that way through minefields, hostage rescues, and covert investigations where no tech was allowed. And now, in this quiet room, only the memories kept humming like a device that never needed recharging. Valor blinked slowly. Elias looked down and smiled faintly. Valor didn't need to run anymore. The mission now wasn't protection. It was to endure, to bear witness. And Elias knew if there came a day Valor couldn't go on, then it would be his turn to carry the story forward. Not far away, inside a federal inspection office in downtown Houston, blue light from a data screen flickered across the face of a young officer, Celia Maris. 27, ponytail tight, eyes sharp. She had studied criminal forensics but chose internal operations not for ambition, but because she once had a dog like Valor. His name was Kuno. He had died during a raid on a human trafficking ring. When the video surfaced dog attacks high-ranking officer to protect declared missing man, Celia requested access to the explosion case file. She was denied. Then granted a heavily redacted, preliminary summary. But while reviewing the archived audio logs, she caught something, a tiny timing discrepancy. A voice flagged as Sawyer Vance issued an early evacuation order just before the blast. But that order didn't appear in the official record. And in Elias's file, there was a deleted note wiped clean with a timed malware that had once read, "Internal evidence secured, preparing to transfer." The rest couldn't be recovered. For Celia, even that was enough. Not to doubt Elias, but to question an entire system that once declared, "We leave no one behind." Celia wasn't the kind to slam fists on boardroom tables. She just quietly opened another file, cross-checked mission logs, found the name Valor referenced 29 times, each marked, "Does not meet threshold for commendation." Celia's hands paused. She looked out the window. A sparrow had landed on the sill, bowed its head, then flew away. Celia reached for her phone and typed a message. "I need to meet Elias Quinn." Not to interrogate, but to listen. And listening, real, patient, deliberate listening, was one of the few things still sacred in those sterile white boardrooms where internal committees gathered behind closed doors. 3 days later, an internal investigation was quietly launched under mounting public pressure. Hundreds of thousands had shared the clip. Valor bursting into the interrogation room, bleeding from the shoulder, pinning Sawyer Vance beneath his chest. The frame was grainy. Elias's face never appeared, but Valor's eyes that look at it silenced assumptions. For the first time in nearly a decade, the name Elias Quinn surfaced in the system again, not as a deserter, but as a question still unanswered. The hearing room was buried in the basement of the federal compound. 4 soundproof walls, 3 cameras, 2 transcription officers, and 1 steel door locked from the outside. No microphones, no live stream. But everything was recorded, not for release, but to know. Valor wasn't allowed inside. He lay just beyond the doorway, head resting on his own leg, eyes half shut. But everyone understood if something went wrong in that room, he would break through that door. No command needed. Elias wore no uniform, no restraints. Yet there was something in his calm gaze that made the officials across from him seem smaller, not because of his rank, but because of trust, the kind that clings to a man like an old scar. Celia Maris was granted authority to lead the inquiry, and no one objected. Because she'd asked the only question that mattered. Why was a declared missing man hunted like a criminal instead of protected like a surviving witness? Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. The first to be questioned was the commanding officer of the AP the night of the explosion. He claimed no memory of a pre-scheduled withdrawal, until Celia played the audio file. Crystal clear. Next came the data tech who had deleted Elias's final report. He fumbled, then fell silent. Denied everything, but could explain nothing. The hearing lasted over 6 hours. No one left as they had entered. Because for the first time in a decade, someone questioned loyalty not to rank, but to truth. And the only one who said nothing was Valor. But when Elias stepped out and gave him the faintest nod, that silent dog's eyes said more than any defense ever could. Trust. Celia waited until the second day of testimony to reveal the evidence, not because it wasn't ready, but because she knew something deeper. Too early, and it feels emotional. At the right time, it feels unavoidable. She placed a small USB drive on the table. It looked like nothing. But when plugged in, the atmosphere shifted instantly. A quiet hush, that particular kind of silence when people realize their excuses are about to expire. The screen lit up blue, a voice recording. Less than 20 seconds long. Pulled from encrypted internal comms, accessed by only 2 people at the time, Sawyer Vance and Elias Quinn. Eastgate will lock after the last unit exits. All teams evacuate before tea time. Leave no one behind. Sawyer's voice. Even filtered through software, his tone was unmistakable, especially the way he always used "leave no one behind," not as a vow, but as a cleansing order. No rescuing. No survivors. Elias said nothing. Neither did Valor. Celia moved on. Next, she placed a notebook on the table, the original log Elias had been writing for weeks. Every name, every time, every location. Details down to the scent of gunpowder, the odd license plate outside a burned site, all meticulously documented. An aging officer tried to dismiss it, until Celia cued a clip from an old security cam 13 seconds long. It showed Sawyer exiting the control center, a hallway map in hand, during the same window when a false fire alarm had been triggered. There was no sound. But his expression as he glanced backward toward where Elias and Valor were last seen revealed something colder than guilt. It looked like peace. That particular peace people wear when they believe the erasure is complete. In the hearing room, no one spoke. No one asked how Celia found the footage. They all know. Sometimes, to uncover the truth, you don't need cutting-edge tools. You just need patience. And a reason not to quit. Celia found hers the day she first saw the video of that bloodied old dog, flinging himself through a door to shield someone the system had tried to erase. That reason was waiting outside the hearing room now under the early light, ears alert, eyes open, a witness that didn't need to testify, only to exist. That day's session ended with no gavels, no verdicts, just silent footage, playing out frame by frame. Then came the final evidence, a partially recovered hard drive retrieved from the old evidence locker sealed after the explosion was brought in a transparent container. Tech had only restored fragments, but fragments were enough. The screen lit again. An empty hallway, fluorescent lights flickering. No voices, no footsteps, just a skewed security cam capturing dust in the air. Then Sawyer, all-black uniform, calm stride, scanning corners like a man inspecting security. But he wasn't holding a passkey panel. He held a physical key, one of only 3 in existence. He paused before a steel door. The sign above it read, Data Vault Restoration Wing. This was the room Elias and Valor had been dispatched to on orders to extract the broken chain of command logs. Sawyer didn't look up, didn't hesitate. He inserted the key, turned, and walked away. The door closed softly. No mechanical click, no metal hiss, just the hush of a final seal. Above the frame, the indicator light shifted from green to red. The system had entered lockdown mode. That meant anyone inside wasn't getting out, no communication, no retreat. Then, in the grainy frame, a flicker, a sudden flare of white, an explosion. The feed cut out just seconds later, but not before it captured one final detail. Sawyer, still in the same spot. No panic, no flinch. Just watching the smoke rise, as if confirming the job was done. Inside the hearing room, silence took over. One man lowered his head. A woman clenched her fists not out of anger, but because she suddenly felt the weight of years spent in silence. Elias didn't look at them. Didn't need to. His eyes remained fixed on the window on the patch of grass beyond it, where Valor lay still. Celia understood in that moment. There were no more questions. There didn't need to be. The answers had been there from the beginning in the way Valor refused to settle in any new home, in the quiet growls at the sound of sirens, in those unblinking eyes sharp, aware, and unwilling to forget. Just once, during the entire inquiry, Elias bowed his head and whispered not to the room, but to himself. He couldn't forget, because I haven't been able to. Outside, the wind curled softly past Valor's ears. He didn't stir, but his chest rose and fell, as if he understood. That the war from 5 years ago, the one no one had listened to, no one had believed in, had finally been heard. And this time, the gate was no longer locked. 1 week after the hearing, a formal statement from the Federal Oversight Committee was sent to all internal agencies. Elias Quinn fully exonerated, all honors, medals, and entitlements reinstated. The news spread fast, as these things often do, but Elias no longer cared about speed or headlines. He sat on the old wooden bench behind the recovery center, right where he and Valor greeted the morning sun each day. In his hand, a cup of coffee gone cold. His eyes weren't on the paper Celia held out. They were tracing the lazy swirl of leaves dancing in the wind. Celia stepped closer, a soft smile on her lips. She held out the document. "You can return," she said gently, "if you want." Elias took it, read the first few lines, then folded it closed and set it down beside the bench. "I know," he replied softly. "But you won't?" she asked. Elias shook his head slowly. "It's not out of anger or mistrust." He glanced down, resting his hand on Valor's head, the dog still lying beside him, eyes half closed, tail flicking just once as if in agreement. "It's just that I already found the one thing I need to protect." Celia looked at them, a man once erased from the record books, and a dog once cast aside like broken gear. She realized then, some people don't come back to pick up where they left off. They return to preserve what's still right in this world. In the new archives, Elias Quinn's file now read, "Status fully active." But in truth, Elias stayed in one place, the West Houston Veterans Recovery Center. He spent his days listening to broken stories from others who had once walked where he'd walked. Every week, he added a few more lines to the fabric-bound notebook, now twice as thick as it had been. And each morning, when Elias stepped out onto the porch and called, Valor rose to his feet slower now, a little shaky, but my eyes are still bright. There was no need to return to the field, because the real battle was here, staying kind in a world that once tried to forget you. The front yard had no fences, just open grass, old maple trees, and a view stretching toward a quiet street. Kids from the nearby low-income blocks often ran across the field at midday, with plastic soccer balls and dreams too young to name. At first, they kept their distance. The big gray dog resting under the porch made them uneasy. One boy even whispered to Elias, "Does he bite?" Elias chuckled, crouching beside Valor. He placed a hand gently on the dog's head. "If you're a good kid," he said, "he'll know." A few days later, a little girl named Marcy, curly-haired and brave, was the first to step forward. She didn't touch Valor. She just sat beside him, placed her hand on the wooden floorboards, and whispered, "I'm a good person." Valor didn't move. But his tail tapped once against the porch. And just like that, he earned a new title. The old guy who protects good people. No one voted for it. It just stuck. Each afternoon, while the kids played and laughed in the grass, a gray shadow sat still at the edge of the porch, ears alert, eyes following every movement, never barking, never interfering. But the moment someone cried, or a hand pushed another too hard, Valor stepped forward. No growl, no snap. Just the presence of a warrior who had once walked through war. And that alone was enough to make the kids fix themselves. Some parents began to stop by. They asked about the dog. Some were surprised to hear Valor was once a high-level canine. Others teared up when they watched the old viral clip again. So, he's the one who saved that man? Elias didn't answer. He just looked out at the yard. "He didn't save anyone," Elias finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He just didn't let something awful happen, not if he could stop it." And from that moment on, Valor became something more than a dog. He became a quiet emblem of loyalty that needed no words, of goodness that didn't need to be taught, and of the quiet strength it takes simply to stay. One afternoon, little Marcy gave Elias a drawing she made with her colored pencils. It was rough and innocent, the kind only a child could create. In the picture, an old man with silver hair sat reading a book. Next to him, a large dog rested its head on the man's leg. Elias didn't say anything. He just smiled, ruffled her curls, and taped the drawing to the wooden door of his room. In the corner of the page, written in bubble letters, Marcy had scribbled, "I believe in that old man." The next morning, Elias put on an old gray shirt, carefully buttoning it up. In his hand, a small ribbon, dark blue, its edges slightly frayed. There were no medals, no dress uniform, because the only thing worth bringing that day was already waiting on the porch, basking in the morning sun. Valor had been up before anyone called. No bark, no sound, just a gentle step forward, his nose nudging Elias's knee. Then he lifted his head, patiently waiting for the signal. They walked together, side by side, to the town square, where the memorial for fallen K9s stood. No velvet rope, no fancy carpet, just a black stone slab carved with names, and beneath it, the inscription, "For those who never needed words to understand the human heart." As Elias and Valor arrived, the crowd instinctively parted, leaving a narrow path that led straight to the memorial. No one clapped, no one spoke, only a few quiet breaths, a few hands covering mouths, and the soft sound of tears slipping down the cheeks of those who had once worn uniforms and fought beside warriors with 4 legs and silent souls. Elias stood still. Valor sat beside him, shoulder tilted from an old wound, but his head held high. Ears alert, eyes steady. A breeze passed through, and the ribbon in Elias's hand lifted gently in the wind. He stepped forward, tying it onto a small iron hook on the stone, the spot where people usually hung wreaths. No speeches, no formal ceremony, only a few children standing at the edge, children who once felt Valor's quiet protection, stepping forward in silence. They placed wild daisies, freshly picked from roadside grass, right by Valor's paws. Elias didn't stop them. He just smiled and whispered softly, so quietly it was barely sound, "Thank you." As the crowd began to drift away, Elias and Valor remained gazing up at the names etched into stone. The sun cast long, golden shadows across the ground. One of those shadows belonged to a dog stretched wide and still across the bricks. But it wasn't just the outline of a retired K9. It was the shape of a witness, a soul that had lived through war, through betrayal, and still chose to stay, to guard what was right. There was no applause. No host stepped forward with a microphone. No banners, no reporters pushing in for a headline. Only a single wooden table, placed in the center of an open square. On it, a modest photo frame, unglassed, weather-worn. Inside the frame, a faded picture. A younger Elias, seated on grass, elbows resting on his knees, his face still unmarked by scars. Beside him, Valor was still just a rookie, coat dark, eyes blazing, ears pricked like he was awaiting a command. No one knew exactly when the photo had been taken. No one asked, because everyone understood. The most important things are never in the documents. A little girl stepped forward, about 8 years old, hair the color of fire, tied back with a frayed white ribbon. She held a sprig of lavender and placed it gently before the frame. And as she turned to leave, she glanced back, whispering something only one soul heard. "Valor." He tilted his head ever so slightly, then sat down quietly. No bark, no movement, just stillness staring into the version of himself in the photograph, as if facing a time when bravery had never been questioned. Somewhere in the crowd, someone began to cry. Software. Barely a whimper. Then silence, again, as though even tears feared to interrupt what was unfolding. An older woman stepped up to Elias and placed her hand over his. She didn't say a word. Didn't need to. And that was enough. There was no list of achievements read aloud. But every glance, every gesture, every small flower left by trembling hands became a silent salute to those who never asked for glory. Valor would never be a chapter in textbooks. But what he left behind lived in the memory of every life he had touched, every witness who once believed the world had run out of kindness. The plaque appeared the next morning. No ceremony, no camera crews, just a few volunteers arriving earlier than usual, carrying an old brass plate, polished by hand, the etching done with care. No glossy finish like a Hall of Fame, no gold trim like a medal. But the words needed no embellishment. Valor, a symbol of loyalty beyond the rules. They bolted it beneath the stone with 4 small nails. No one cut a ribbon. No speeches were made. Only silence, long, fragile, beautiful. A silence so whole that nobody dared to break it. Marcy came forward again, pigtails bouncing, arms wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. She walked right up to Valor without fear or hesitation, sat beside him, and placed a round pebble before his nose. "For you to keep," she whispered, "in case something bad tries to come again." Valor didn't move, but his ears remained high. And Elias, standing a few paces behind, remembered a morning long ago, in a place with no name, when a pebble had been handed to him in the same quiet way. Back then, the giver had been Valor. The sun climbed higher, casting long streaks across the white stone square. Someone raised their phone to take a picture, then slowly lowered it again. Because some moments aren't meant to be captured. They're meant to be kept. A small bench sat nearby, empty, left perhaps for the witnesses who no longer walked among them, for the unnamed dogs, the unlisted souls, who once stood between danger and the innocent, and now stood in memory only. And under that bronze plaque, in the shadow of that quiet square, sat a gray-coated sentinel saying nothing, not leaving, just being, as if to remind the world that loyalty never needed permission to exist. A breeze rolled gently through the plaza, rustling the grass, causing the trees to bow. No one said a word. No one took a step. They all just watched. Elias leaned slightly forward, reaching down for Valor's leash. He didn't tug, didn't command, just gave the slightest familiar squeeze signal 12, the one they used in over 100 life-or-death operations. Valor stood up, not quickly, but without hesitation. His coat is now grayer, his gait slower, but his eyes still clear. The eyes that had once led Elias through fire. The eyes that never wavered when Elias disappeared. The eyes that now, once again, looked up as if to ask, "Where to now?" Elias didn't answer. Elias simply smiled, a smile that hadn't visited his face in a long, long time. And so the two of them, a soldier without insignia and a dog without a mission, turned away from the memorial together. Their footsteps fell into rhythm with the fading light, casting a single steady shadow across the white stone floor. No drums, no anthem, only the whisper of the wind, and the slow, even cadence of steps, like breathing. Ahead of them, the sun was setting. But the path was still lit. There was nothing left to say. Because some battles don't begin with bullets. Some begin the moment a four-legged soul refuses to abandon the one they love. And some victories don't come from courtrooms or medals, but from a quiet nod, a steady stride, and a dog who once walked through fire, betrayal, and oblivion, and still chose to stay. The story of Elias and Valor isn't just about uncovering the truth. It's about a bond that transcended time, crossed distance, and defied every rule written by man. A man who had been erased, a dog who had been dismissed, and yet both chose to remain, not for a cause, but for a promise. A German Shepherd isn't just a smart breed. They are loyalty made flesh, courage made quiet, love made unconditional. And if anyone still questions whether goodness truly exists in this world, just look into Valor's eyes, and you'll understand kindness is never erased.